On report of the Trade Bill, Baroness Fairhead.
My Lords, I beg to move that this bill be now further considered on report.
The question is that this bill be now further considered on report. As many of that opinion will say content. Contrary not content, contents have it. After Clause 5, Amendment 22, Lord Hayne.
My Lords, I beg to move Amendment 22 standing in my name and those of the noble Lords Kerr and Bruce and the noble Baroness Altman. This cross-party supported amendment is consistent with the previous amendment carried by your Lordship's House and which the Government accepted when the EU Withdrawal Act was adopted last summer. But it is vital that those provisions in Section 10 of the Withdrawal Act are reflected in this bill, which concerns not our divorce deal, as that Act did, but our long-term trading relationships. In principle, the UK has joined Ireland and the EU in a shared objective of avoiding a hard border on the island of Ireland in order to help protect the hard-won peace process delivered by the Good Friday Agreement, a peace process that is still just that, a process, which in my view has dangerously reversed these past couple of years. The border is often described as the Irish border, a description which seems to absolve the United Kingdom of any ownership of it. But it is a UK land border with Ireland. If we leave, it will be a border between the UK and the EU, so it's our responsibility as much as it's Ireland's and the EU's responsibility under any circumstances. My Lords, only last week the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, David Stirling, warned of the potentially grave and profound consequences, including a sharp rise in unemployment, the collapse or flight of businesses, and potential unrest of a no-deal Brexit for Northern Ireland, which, lest we forget, voted by 56% to 44% to remain in the European Union in 2016. Senior civil servants don't usually speak so candidly and compellingly, my Lords. The advocates of a kamikaze Brexit might take notice, and might also take notice of the strong words of the 50 or more Northern Ireland businesses who wrote to MPs in similar terms over the weekend. My Lords, the extent of trade and traffic over the Irish border is huge. 110 million person crossings take place every year. Northern Ireland, with its population of 1.8 million people, exports 3.4 billion over the border, by far its biggest export destination outside of the United Kingdom, and the first export destination for new and growing enterprises. At least 5,000 Northern Ireland companies trade with their neighbours over the border with Ireland. Tens of thousands of people live on one side and work on the other. Supply chains operate across the border without impediment. Over 400,000 lambs and 750 million litres of milk are exported across the border to Ireland for processing. 177,000 heavy goods vehicles and 206,000 light vans cross the border every single month. 4.6 million crossings a year, along with 22 million car crossings, and these take place all along a 300-mile border with its near 300 crossing points. My Lords, by way of comparison, the Norway-Sweden land border is 1,000 miles long, with only 57 crossing points. And that is a hard border, accompanied by infrastructure at the frontier, yet also the very one most cited by those Brexiteers who seek to brush aside our border with the Republic as something which can be solved with a few cameras and online programmes. There are unique arrangements under the Good Friday Belfast Agreement for North-South cooperation. The Department for exiting the EU lists no less than 157 different areas of cross-border work and cooperation. Many of them have been facilitated by the common legal and policy framework provided by Ireland's and the UK's common membership of the European Union since 1973. These areas are the things of everyday life, the precious signs of normality in the post-conflict border region, and there must never be new barriers or controls erected to block or discourage them. They include food safety, tourism, specialist schools, fighting crime, tackling environmental pollution, water quality and supply, waste management, bus services, train services, cancer care, blood transfusions, gas and electricity supply. We must never disrupt these arrangements either through a divorce deal or, as this amendment is directed, any new trade agreements. WTO rules which primarily remove barriers to trade and prevent unfair discrimination will not allow these areas of North-South cooperation and everyday cross-border movement to be maintained. Both WTO rules and the obligations of an EU member state would strictly limit the kind of bilateral cooperation between the Republic and the UK as a non-EU member state, which has made the border invisible in everyday life. My Lord, some find all these essential facts to be tiresome obstacles to their Brexit dream. They argue that the border in Ireland will never need any new barriers, that the UK will never erect any on its side, and that somehow Ireland, which by law has itself to obey both EU and WTO customs and regulatory rules, won't do so either. The same people go on to use the word technology as a magic solution, repeatedly citing reports by one or two alleged experts on how maybe such solutions might work and might be ready someday, somehow. One such study, still bandied about, is known as the Smart Borders 2.0, sometimes wrongly described as an EU report. This was presented to the European Parliament's Committee on Constitutional Affairs in November 2017, together with opposing views from other experts. However, the report, which was based upon arrangements at the Norway-Sweden border that I've mentioned, does not carry the imprimatur of any of the EU institutions. Furthermore, proposals in Smart Border 2.0 rely on both physical infrastructure and staffed border posts, which would be incompatible with the very common travel area which the EU and the UK have agreed should continue. The technology proposed is untested and does not address concerns surrounding the management of animal and plant health, sanitary, phytosanitary and other regulatory issues that would require checks. Given the all-island nature of the agri-food industry on the island and constant livestock crossings, any need for such checks at the border would be an utter disaster. In short, ideas like this are already in breach of the law under the EU Withdrawal Act, the very one this House and the other place passed, in that it rules out measures, and I quote, which, quote, create or facilitate border arrangements between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland after exit day, which feature border infrastructure, including border posts or checks or controls that did not exist before exit day and are not in accordance with an agreement between the United Kingdom and the EU. The same wording that is in this Amendment 22, my Lords. Your Lordship's House own EU Select Committee concluded rightly that technological solutions were a long-term aspiration and could only mitigate, not eliminate, the need for border controls or infrastructure in the event of Brexit. This is a very important point which underlines the vital need for this amendment. No amount of technology can substitute for the very regulatory alignment or equivalence which today makes customs checks and security controls across the Irish border unnecessary. The border is completely open and invisible today because there are common rules for trading, services and people movement on both sides. Various wheezes by Brexiteers to monitor barcodes on lorries and so on will only work if there is a common compliance regime both sides of the border. Yet their very mission, that is to say the Brexiteers' mission, is to end those common rules and that common compliance. That is what Brexit is all about. The same applies to checks which some Brexiteers have suggested 20 miles away from the border. The reason that Jaguar cars, for example, or its components, can be sent for sale without checks or inspections through the Channel Tunnel or across the Irish border is because Jaguar has signed up to thousands of common EU standards and other regulations. If Jaguar were to be found in breach, say by a competitor or by the European Commission, they could be taken to the European Court of Justice. Yet it is this very compliance regime the Brexiteers reject. No amount of fancy technology, my lords, no max fact wheezes can overcome this reality. And by the way, if the UK fell out of the EU with the no deal many Brexiteers want to set us gloriously free, the World Trade Organization rules that they crave for would also impose on the UK a hard border requirement, outlining special treatment of an EU member state, Ireland, by the UK, which as a third country would be outside the highly developed free trade agreement, which is the European Union. And even the heavily politicised and heavily spun Northern Ireland Affairs Committee report of the 9th of March, just a few days ago, confirms that there are currently no technology border solutions anywhere in the world that can deliver a frictionless Irish border, therefore slaying a few hard Brexit unicorns. The committee took evidence and reported that technology proposals for a frictionless border, and I quote, have been tested somewhere in the world, just not in one single border. And as such, the border in Northern Ireland would be the first, and I quote, the first and a leading example in the world of this kind. The committee concluded this is not a simple quick fix solution, and implementing it in Northern Ireland would represent a world first. My lords, please. That is like saying we can do brain surgery, we can do transplant surgery, it's just that we haven't done brain transplant surgery yet, but we'll have a go anyway. My lords, that all shows clearly why this amendment is absolutely vital and why the government accepted it in terms in the Commons as part of the Withdrawal Act. Now we're asking Parliament to do the same in our future trading arrangements covered by this bill, and I hope the government will accept it. Please note that this amendment does not prescribe any particular new border arrangements. My lords, this is a very important point. It does not place the government in a straitjacket. All it requires is the very outcome we are all, leave or remain, government or opposition, London or Dublin, supposed to be signed up to, namely the invisible open border on the island of Ireland we currently have. Without that, we all know what will happen, my lords, because we're already starting to see it happen. The reverse of the painstakingly constructed, hard-won process of peace, stability and trust on the island of Ireland. And we know where that ends. Putting back up barriers of all kinds which will spark division and potential conflict for generations to come. My lords, I hope that your Lordship's House accepts this Amendment 22.
Amendment proposed, insert the new clause as printed on the Marshall list.
My name is on this amendment, and I have very little to add to the authoritative way in which Lord Hayne introduced it. But like him, it seems to me that we should be pressing at an open door here. At the start of our report stage, the Minister, responding to me on the question of what the tariff regime would be in the event of no deal, indicated that we would be told in due course, and such is her power that I understand the schedules were published this morning, conveniently for our debate. I'm sure that's the only reason, and I'm sure we owe it entirely to the Minister. The timing is apt. According to the press, I have seen nothing myself from the government, but according to the press, it is made clear in today's announcement that temporarily, I don't know how long that means, but temporarily at the outset, if there were a tariff regime required on the 30th of March, because we had left with no deal, it would not be applied at the inner Irish border. There would be no tariffs, there would be no customs checks, there would be imports would be exempt from quotas, although for imports from the EU other than across the Irish border, there would be tariffs charged, 10% on motor cars, quite a high tariff on agricultural products of various kinds. Now, I'm not quite sure how long such an arrangement could last. It will be a breach of WTO rules, but I guess WTO will live with that for a bit. It will be slightly odd if I want to buy a BMW. I never bought a BMW, but if I wanted to buy a BMW, it would be 10% cheaper if I imported it via Dublin and Belfast. I can't see this lasting on a permanent basis. But my point is that the government are quite right to exempt the inner Irish border. It really matters. It therefore seems to me to be obvious that it should be easy for the Minister to accept Lord Hayne's amendment, Amendment 22. They have already accepted it in another context, as he explained, and today's announcements show that they would actually intend to apply it on the inner Irish border anyway. Lord Keane of Ely, speaking the other night in reply to Lord Campbell of Pitt and Weems' question, said, "The whole point of the present withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol is to ensure that we adhere not only to the terms but to the spirit of the Belfast Agreement." I applaud that. The withdrawal agreement is dead, but whatever the future regime is, we must uphold the spirit and letter of the Belfast Agreement. And that is what this amendment would permit us to do. Since it seems to be in line with what the government are doing in their actions, today's tariff announcements, and in their words, Lord Keane's speech last night, I very much hope that the Minister will be able to accept the amendment.
My Lords, I want to urge the House as strongly as I can, speaking from position in Northern Ireland, to ask the House to support this amendment in the name of Lord Hayne. As the debate has come and gone in the last few weeks over this entire BrExit situation, there is growing concern right across the business community in Northern Ireland as to the hidden implications of what we are debating. The hidden implications are those which will affect every strand of the business community in Northern Ireland, because they are finding themselves thrust into the knife edge of Brexit. And the whole border question has got implications that are obvious, but they are also hidden. Lord Hayne has rightly referred to the Belfast Agreement. And while it is all too easy to raise this worry about an increase in violence and an increase in the breakdown of relationships, and to overplay that card, it is equally dangerous not to mention it. And I think the subtlety of that situation is such that, in the words of this amendment, we are not only strengthening the spirit of the Belfast Agreement, we're also recognising that it is an integral part of the whole vista of trade, because across the border counties and across the links between the Republic of Ireland and the province of Northern Ireland, there are numerous small businesses which, in a sense, are absolutely identifiable as Irish, because they're small. They may not employ many people, but they are the absolute breath of the local community. And it is those businesses, as well as the major BMWs of this world, if Lord Clare will forgive me, it's those businesses which are not only the heartbeat of our community, they are also indicative of why Northern Ireland will probably be the greatest sufferer if what we fear today in the light of yesterday's events down the corridor, what we fear may well come to pass. And so, my lords, I would urge you to take seriously the thinking behind this amendment. Lord Hayne is ideally placed to speak about this situation from his years of experience of dealing with us in Northern Ireland and of seeing something of what makes that community tick. And so while I'm introducing one element which is not that of detailed trade negotiation or trade principles, it's, I believe, genuinely a real reason why this amendment has got to be passed.
I rise briefly to support this amendment, which I've also signed. We have sadly arrived at a point where the deeply divided Conservative Party has deeply divided the nation. And the irony of that is it's the Conservative and Unionist Party that currently presents the biggest threat to the integrity of the United Kingdom. And just over 2 weeks, 15 days before we are due to leave the European Union, the government, if it doesn't take action or accept this amendment, potentially presents the greatest threat to the Good Friday Agreement, because this hard-won agreement was forged in the understanding that the UK was and would remain in the European Union, and that the UK and the European Union would be its joint guarantors. We're now moving into a new situation where it is unclear who the guarantors would be. So leaving without an agreement, and I would say, my lords, people talk about a deal, there is no deal. There is an agreement, twice rejected, on how we leave the EU. The deal comes afterwards and has to be negotiated. We haven't even begun to start that. Today, the government has published 2 statements on trade and tariffs, one specifically for Northern Ireland. Yet these statements acknowledge only what the UK government can or will do. It cannot, by definition, legislate for any EU measures. And I quote from the Northern Ireland statement: "Because these are unilateral measures, they only mitigate the impacts from exit that are within the government's control. These measures do not set out the position in respect of tariffs or processes to be applied to goods moving from Northern Ireland to Ireland." So, will the EU impose tariffs on agricultural products from the UK to Ireland or to the rest of the EU just at the beginning of the lamb sales? Is that what we would be facing? And that's just one sector, one example. So that's why this new clause is needed, because it's a clear and unequivocal statement that nothing can be done, nothing should be done, that undermines in detail the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. As long as the government stands by its position, there is no agreement that conforms to this clause, because the House of Commons has rejected the one agreement twice, so we are in danger of being in default. So Parliament either has to exact the backstop, which was the means of securing acceptance, twice rejected by the House of Commons, or the government has to abandon the red lines and seek more time to pursue a softer strategy built around the customs union. Better still, in my view, and I guess my colleagues on these benches would agree, we should suspend Article 50 and put the deal, would have to be with the backstop, to a vote of the people, with the option to rescind Article 50 altogether on the basis that there is no agreement that either commands the majority in Parliament or is consistent with the Good Friday Agreement. Currently, there is no such agreement on the table. So I would commend this amendment to the House on the basis that adopting this new clause will give the House of Commons a building block for squaring the circle which the Government and the House of Commons has so far utterly failed to do. I really commend this amendment.
Briefly, my name is also on this amendment to echo every word of the excellent speeches from the Noble Lord Hayne, Lord Kerr of Kinlochard, Lord Eames and Lord Bruce of Benachy. We have an international obligation. We have signed the Belfast Agreement, a long-standing, deep and binding international agreement. And somehow it seems to have been forgotten or overlooked in the frenzy of focus on some kind of what's called pure Brexit. Lord Eames called this the hidden elements. It has become frighteningly clear, my lords, that the Brexiteers didn't understand Brexit properly. They imposed impossible red lines and inconsistent red lines, which have left us in the position we are now. And while the economics imply that staying in the customs union and single market will protect frictionless borders and supply chains and our manufacturing industry and services, it does make us a rule taker and force us to have some connection with the ECJ, which has led, on the political side, to this drive towards dropping the backstop as if it was some kind of problem that we shouldn't care about. Actually, it should be something that we deeply care about. Or even considering no deal, which clearly leaves Northern Ireland high and dry. Leaving the customs union and single market cannot support an open border. No deal cannot support an open border. Canada plus cannot support an open border. And it saddens me that so many of our colleagues from these benches are willing to countenance playing fast and loose with the hard-won peace that we have achieved in Northern Ireland for the sake of some kind of trading advantage which may or may not occur. So I appeal to my colleagues on the front bench and to my fellow peers on the Conservative and Unionist Party benches alongside me to accept this amendment. It has already been accepted as part of the Withdrawal Agreement Act, but we surely, my lords, cannot and must not abandon the frictionless border on Northern Ireland or cut Northern Ireland off from the rest of the UK.
I want to address something that is in this amendment and important, but which has not been picked up so far. And in saying so, I support the amendment. The amendment proposes to support the Good Friday Agreement. People tend to think of that in terms of the structures within Northern Ireland and between North and South, but a key part of the agreement was the arrangement of the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. For 10 years, it didn't meet. Already the British and Irish governments were both in default of the Good Friday Agreement for a decade. The European Union supported the Good Friday Agreement, as did our friends in the United States. In the context of the Good Friday Agreement and addressing our difficulties, it seems to me that the suggestion that Ireland should be with the 27 negotiating or having negotiations on their behalf with the UK is actually ignoring the Good Friday Agreement. The European Union, if Britain and Ireland were not fulfilling it, should have been pushing the British and Irish governments to come together to reach agreements on that issue that they could together bring to Brussels. And the suggestion that such a thing would be a breach of European Union understandings, well, it wouldn't, but not to do it is a breach of the Good Friday Agreement. And it seems to me, for example, if the British government and the Irish government had already, or would over the next few months, agree on the main north-south economic transport issues, which are agriculture and agri-food business and electricity, and to agree that they would approach Brussels and request that these issues be dealt with on an all-island basis, because they already largely are, it is highly likely that Brussels would accept that, whatever the other issues. It wouldn't require a backstop, it would be a front-loading. But the key thing is that the British and Irish governments need to be working together on this. That's what the last clause in this amendment says. And in some ways, it ought to be the first clause and the first stop, not a backstop, that they come together and propose something. And any suggestion, and it has happened repeatedly that people have said, oh no, it's not appropriate for Ireland and the United Kingdom to negotiate together because this is something between the UK and the EU as a whole, simply doesn't work if people believe that they and the EU supports the Good Friday Agreement. It requires and mandates direct negotiations between London and Dublin on all joint issues. It has not been happening, and I appeal to the Minister, as I appeal to ministers in the Republic of Ireland, to come together on this issue. Ireland should be a bridge between the UK and the EU, not a bulwark for the EU against the UK.
My Lord, it's a pleasure following my noble friend who speaks with great authority on this issue. And in following that, I just wanted to use one example to highlight how important this amendment is in maintaining this spirit and including the contents of the agreement, and to use the example of today's announcements not just on the proposed tariffs that may be applied on a no-deal Brexit, but also the written ministerial statement on how that will impact on the Northern Ireland border, already referred to by the noble Lord Kerr. I was grateful to have an opportunity of having a conversation with the Minister about this today. I was most grateful. But the proposals for the tariff regime, which would be an increase of 489 tariff lines on goods from the European Union, which would have to have some form of mechanism across the border in Northern Ireland, needs to be seen into the context of operating within a year. This is not simply an emergency or massively temporary proposal. A year is a very long time in the context of some of the statistics that the noble Lord Hayne made. There were 46 million vehicle crossings at the 15 Northern Ireland border locations over the last year, according to the Northern Ireland Statistics Agency. 3.8 million of these were goods vehicles. Nearly 3/4 of deliveries are small businesses, and 2/3 of cross-border trade is bilateral agri-food and intermediate trade. And what that means is that these are small businesses, as already referred to. 80% are low value. Often these are individual businesses doing trade on a self-employed basis, but every single one of those people will have to be registered with an EORI, an Economic Operator Index number. We know that only 1/6 of all businesses have so far registered for that. So we know that the system, even published today, is not operable. But it does mean that new processes and procedures have to be carried out. The government is giving no advice to specifically Northern Ireland businesses with regards to that. They believe a unilateral action against the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement and clearly against the spirit of an all-islands economy. A unilateral approach, the government believes, is the way forward. But how can it be a unilateral approach if tariffs will not be applied from goods coming from Ireland, but then will subsequently be applied if those goods are part of intermediate trade with Great Britain? And Liz Truss, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, was asked at lunchtime where the checks would be carried out. And she said, I quote, "I believe a border in the UK." And this is the Chief Secretary of the Treasury today. Now, what does that mean, a border in the UK? One may, if one is tolerant, one may forgive her not knowing the terminology of Great Britain and the United Kingdom, but that is unforgivable given the situation that she said that she's voting for a no-deal Brexit this evening in the other place. So what kind of consultation is now actively being carried out, not just with the Irish government, as my noble friend had indicated is of urgency, but with businesses on both sides of the border that will be operating? And the final point, and this is why it is linked with the long-term basis, is that the unilateral approach is clearly not WTO compliant unless the government triggers one element in WTO processes on public morals. There are some dispensations that can be provided in extremis on the basis of public morals that can set aside a system where we will not apply tariffs from one country if we have no intention of applying to the rest of the world. That would be, I think, a very retrograde step if the government is activating at the WTO a public morals clause on a situation so delicate as that on the Northern Ireland border when it comes to what seems to be the position of the government, setting aside security and border integrity for the basis of a unilateral no-deal proposal. The government should see sense and support this amendment because this provides the framework for these consultations to be carried out.
My Lords, this has been a very short but a very poignant and moving debate where we've reached back into history and we've tried to articulate fears and concerns. I'm sorry.
The Noble Lord will allow me. I entirely agree with the difficulties associated with the border and the need for a soft border. What I'm not sure about is that this amendment achieves that. This amendment would not, I think, directly affect the no-deal situation at all. And the only, I think it describes what I regard as a soft border, and it's what I would like to see. And it's what I think the Prime Minister's deal with the backstop and so on is all achieved, is all intended to do. But we're dealing now with a situation which is different from that. But so far as I'm concerned, I would love to see a secure, soft border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. What I'm not at all sure about, and I would be glad to have help on this, is that this amendment secures that in any way whatsoever, because it wouldn't be the result of an agreement between the European Union and the UK that a no-deal came along. A no-deal is the very opposite of an agreement between the EU and the UK. And then the other problem, I think, is that Ireland's relationships with countries that are no longer in the EU would be regulated by the EU. So I would be glad to have some explanation from the people that know all about this, exactly how this amendment achieves the result which I and they wish to achieve.
Well, Lord, I think that's a well-made point, which I think is probably better if the mover of the motion, Lord Hayne, responds to in detail. But I think the wording is clear that this is, and indeed as Lord Hayne said, my noble friend said, this takes us beyond the withdrawal, sorry, the no-deal exit problem, because it is for the future, and it's meant to govern future arrangements between the UK and Ireland across that border. But I think Lord Hayne may have more detail to put on it. But I don't think the point itself destroys the arguments that have been made, and I understand where the noble and learned Lord is coming from. But the issues that were raised and we're talking about today are for all time in the future, and they're important to build on our history and our practice up until this point. Lord Eames, I think, said very, very powerfully in getting across this idea that if there is an opportunity for this House and indeed in any other place to strengthen the spirit of the Belfast Agreement, it should be supported, and this is an opportunity for us to do so. And he did it. He said it was not just the history, but it was also about the future for those who work and operate in Northern Ireland and in Ireland itself, about trade, about opportunities. And the combination of having peace and prosperity which after all is what we all seek at all times, surely is not something that the Conservative and Unionist government is really going to whip its members to vote against. I do hope that the government will find in itself the ability to accept this amendment and allow us to move forward.
My Lords, can I add my thanks to all noble lords who've contributed to this short but very profound debate, and in particular want to thank Lord Hayne for moving this. I think the whole House recognises the important role that he played while Secretary of State in helping that process gather ground into fruition, and it's been a proud part of successive governments that we cherish and nurture that hard-won peace. And that's the reason why, right at the outset, in the future relationship white paper that was published, we said that the prime objective would be that the UK and the EU meet their commitments to Northern Ireland and Ireland through the overall future relationship, preserving the constitutional and economic integrity of the UK, honouring the letter and the spirit of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and ensuring that the operational legal text the UK agree with the EU on a backstop solution as part of the withdrawal agreement will not have to be used. That was very much at the heart of the objective that we had there. So we're absolutely committed to that. And the Good Friday Agreement, and of course all of that part of it. Now, I don't take Lord Bruce's points out of context. He was making a point about division, but of course he would, I'm sure, recognise that the whole thrust of the government and the Prime Minister's negotiations, all that the withdrawal agreement is about, is seeking to secure the type of border arrangements which my noble and learned friend Lord Mackay referred to. And I believe that Lord Hayne, Lord Eames, Lord Allardyce and others who've all been talking about are seeking to work towards. The peace on the island of Ireland, between Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement, the partnership between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland in this context surely must be the red line above all red lines that we need to preserve. That's the reason why, and Lord Kerr referred to this, that of course in the EU Withdrawal Act there is the amendment which he was instrumental in securing, making that explicit, and that has been a key part of what Her Majesty's Government have done when they've been engaging in negotiations on these matters, and of course is brought to fruition in the withdrawal agreement, which of course, were the withdrawal agreement passed yesterday in another place, then we wouldn't have the need for this amendment or this discussion. These are matters which are in the extremely unwelcome event that there is a no deal on this. There have been some specific points which have been raised, so let me try to address them in turn, and I hope that will help noble lords in deciding what to do with this particular amendment. Lord Purvis asked about saying that this has been emerging over 12 months, 480 times increased current position with the EU. The government has had to find a way of ensuring there is, from the UK perspective, no border in the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement. Any checks that must be carried out for non-revenue purposes will be done away from the border, and HMRC is very familiar with carrying out such checks on that basis. And our friend Baroness Altman asked, how does the plan work to work with suppliers? These are unilateral measures, not for goods moving from Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland, which would be subject to the EU's common external tariff and EU single market rules. The only way to avoid a hard border is to commit to enter into discussions with the EU Commission to jointly agree long-term measures to avoid a hard border. And Lord Purvis asked, will there be a border in the UK? The government does not intend to construct infrastructure at the Northern Ireland land border. We will also not carry out any new checks on goods moving from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. HMRC will assess the risks and take a risk-based approach to investigating allegations of breaches of those rules. Lord Purvis also asked about status in terms of WTO, in terms of whether it breaches the MFN model. We're confident the policy is in line with our WTO obligations, taking into account the unique set of social, political and economic circumstances of Northern Ireland. In developing our policy alongside WTO rules, we've also had to take into consideration a broader set of our international obligations, including those under the Good Friday Agreement. Furthermore, as we've set out, these arrangements are strictly temporary. Lord Kerr asked us what was the meaning of temporary in this respect, and we've said that that is a period up to 12 months in this context. Can I come to the point which was raised by Lord Mackay, because I think that that is material to what we've been discussing here today, because he turned to he looked at the amendment and he made the important observation that the amendment as worded, of course, seeks an agreement between the UK and the Government of Ireland. That's the way that the amendment is worded in its current form. Whereas, of course, because the Republic of Ireland and the border of Ireland, as he rightly said, is the border between the United Kingdom and the European Union, then, of course, it would need to be an agreement with the European Union, which is, I think, the point that my noble and learned friend was making. And in that sense, of course, the way in which the amendment is currently worded would be unlawful in that context, because it refers to the Government of Ireland as opposed to the EU. Lord Hayne also asked about whether, he said, this amendment doesn't put the government in a straitjacket. The amendment would seek to limit flexibility. No facilitations, for example, would rule out future technologies, something which the EU has specifically agreed to look at as a priority once the withdrawal agreement has been agreed. In terms of EU imports into Northern Ireland, not across the land border, do tariffs apply? Yes. The waiver only applies to goods moving from Ireland to Northern Ireland. This is a temporary measure that would need to be implemented. Lord Kerr asked about potential, I suppose, arbitraging in terms of pricing. Many things affect the price of cars in terms of taxing and currencies, and an individual car from Dublin driven across to Belfast will be exempt from the 10% tariff, but wouldn't necessarily be cheaper. But these are measures that would be temporary. Surely this breaks most favoured nations. I've addressed that point. I hope that noble lords will feel that I have addressed a number of the points which have raised. I do thank all noble lords for raising these matters. I assure them once again that this has been absolutely upfront and central at the heart of the government's strategy to preserve that hard-won peace and to preserve that special relationship. It is something which needs to be there only in the event of a no deal, which is what we are all working tirelessly to avoid. But I would also, perhaps also, just invite the noble lord, perhaps if he could, address that point just on the wording between the Government of Ireland and the European Union, which to our reading means that if the amendment were passed, then it would be unlawful in its current phrasing. If he could address that specifically, I'm sure it would be helpful to all noble lords, but I'm happy to give way to it.
My lord, thank you very much, noble lord, for giving way. There's one, I've been waiting for a voice to appear during this debate, and it hasn't. That's the voice of the people of the Republic of Ireland. I live in the Republic of Ireland. I would like to get across to your lordships the incalculable level of anxiety that's been caused to the people of the Republic of Ireland by our apparent indifference to what happens, for example, in no deal. It is something I cannot stress enough. And when noble lords decide which this side of this discussion they wish to vote on, I'm sure it will go to a vote, I would beg you to consider that my neighbours, the people I live on, which particularly as Lord Eames mentioned, most particularly small farmers, both sides of the border, are terrified of what will happen should we, by some ridiculous means, crash out. And I would really, really beg the Minister to try to add the voice of the people of the Republic of Ireland to this debate, because they do have a voice in this.
I recognise that, and I know that the noble Lord is passionate about the Republic of Ireland, as he said, as he resides there. But I think this comes to a fundamental point here, of course, that anxiety would not be necessary if the withdrawal agreement, which was agreed in December, had actually been passed in the other place last night. That must be the best solution to remove the anxiety that he has referred to. But the fact that he also alludes to a very important piece of work which needs to get going immediately is actually rebuilding those friendships and those links and that partnership which has served us so well in recent decades, to ensure that the progress which has been made has not been lost. That needs to start immediately. But as I say, I take on board very much the point which he's raised.
Can I first of all thank the noble Lord Putnam, my noble friend, for the point that he made, because I have lots of friends in the island of Ireland, particularly on both sides, and I know that there's a real feeling of hurt on citizens of the Republic that our tangled history, colonial history if you like, going back centuries, which created enormous distrust and suspicion from Dublin towards us, and it was overcome by building trust almost day by day, week by week, over the last 20 years of governments of all colours. John Major particularly, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and subsequently. That sense of pain is very, very deep. My Lords, can I thank the noble Lord Bates, the Minister, for his generosity towards me, and I feel very strongly, and this goes to the point raised by the noble Lord Mackay of Clashfern, whose interventions I always find very interesting and often agree with and intellectually testing. The point is this, that we have no idea what sort of future awaits us. No idea. We don't know whether we'll have an agreement with the European Union at all. There are vociferous voices, some in this House, but particularly in the House of Commons, that don't want to deal with the European Union. And therefore, the terms of this amendment are absolutely right. That the default position that you fall back on is that you need to at least agree with the Irish Republic, in the terms of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, how you manage this border issue. So I don't see that is the obstacle in the terms of the amendment that he's perhaps suggested, or that the Minister suggested as well.
I'm grateful to the noble Lord for giving way, and not least because I confess I'm almost certainly behind the curve here and may well be about to ask a very inept question. But this proposed amendment is directed solely to an international trade agreement between the UK and the European Union. And in the event of a no-deal exit, I'm unclear whether any future trade agreements that are going to be reached will be with the European Union as opposed to, for example, Germany, France, individual EU countries. And if that were to be the position, as I say, I may well be barking up a most irrelevant tree. If there was to be a future agreement with Germany, this clause would not, as I understand it, bite. Is that right?
Planning to leave the European Union. While the Germans remain in the European Union, their external trade will be conducted by the European Union.
I was going to make exactly that point that Lord Kerr makes far more authoritatively. The European Union negotiates as a bloc, and the Brexiteers want to break free of that for their own reasons.
I would love to vote for this amendment if I thought it achieved what the noble Lord and the Irish people, I think all of us, want. but unfortunately it only outlaws agreements between the UK and the European Union in the circumstances narrated. Now, my belief is that if this happens, it will not be as a result of any agreement between the EU and the UK, but because there's no agreement between the EU and the UK. And therefore, I do not see myself, it's possibly my blindness, but I do not see how this goes anywhere to preventing the evil that all of us here, and certainly I very much believe that it's, for most of us anyway, if not all, I can't speak for anybody but myself, strictly speaking, but judging from what I've heard, all of us here want the situation to be that it will be a soft border, whatever happens, between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And I'm sure the Republic people want that, the Northern Irish people want that, and certainly I and all who love them want that.
But if I may say so to the noble lord, that we may all want it. In fact, we all say we do. But unless we will the means, we cannot actually ensure it and guarantee it. And that's what this amendment does in respect to future trade agreements. The same wording was accepted by this House and accepted by the government in the other place and has become part of the Withdrawal Act. But that's part of, if you like, the divorce settlement. What we need to do is ensure that the same principles apply to the future and our future trading relationship. We always, in terms of...
With apologies to the House, we are in report stage now and we should get on with it.
Well, if I can conclude, my lords, and maybe this might help the noble Lord, Lord Mackay. It's what this amendment does not say that's important. This amendment does not tie the government's hands, except in terms of the exact requirements for the future, because that's not appropriate in a clause of this kind in the bill, as I hope it will be accepted in a new act, except by spelling out for new trade, the principles that the government's already accepted in the withdrawal agreement. And I'm therefore, it's already on statute, I'm therefore puzzled as to why the government is not accepting this agreement by acclamation.
Noble for giving way. It may be helpful to the House if I can explain precisely on that point what our hesitation is. It is that Section 10(2)(b) of the EU Withdrawal Act prohibits regulations creating new border arrangements, i.e. arrangements that did not exist before exit day, unless they are in accordance with agreement between the UK and the EU. This amendment would prevent any arrangements unless they are subject to an agreement between the UK and the Government of Ireland. Such an agreement, in our view, would be unlawful for Ireland to enter into, as customs and a common commercial policy fall within the exclusive competence of the EU. I just wanted that point to be clear on the record, but
And that point, but the point is this, that we have obviously, in terms of the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, we are bound and obligated, including with the approval by treaty of the European Union, as the noble Lord Lord Purvis said, we're bound to agree things with Dublin. That's the way it works. That's part of the Good Friday Agreement that has the blessing of the European Union. And I just repeat, my lords, that we have no idea as yet of our future trading relationships with anybody, including across the Irish border. No idea at all. What this amendment does is spell out the principles that have already been accepted in the Withdrawal Act, already in statute, agreed by the government, and I therefore wish to test the opinion of the House on this amendment.
The question is that Amendment 22 be agreed to. As many as of that opinion will say content?
Content.
Contrary, not content?
Not content.
Clear the bar. My Lords, there have voted contents 285, not contents 184. So the contents have it. After Clause 5, Amendment 23, Lord Purvis.
My Lords, I rise to move Amendment 23 in my name. I have a feeling that this is somewhat like an intermission between two parts of the main feature, so I shall, this afternoon, so I shall be brief. This amendment is even more important given the vote in the Commons last night and the possible votes that are likely to be coming up in the other place. The amendment provides for a duty on government to update the information that it published on the 21st of February. I signed up to a weekly EU trade newsletter from the European Commission at the start of this bill's consideration. And it includes a weekly digest of the latest news on EU trade, new trade negotiating texts, reports and studies about ongoing discussions, upcoming events and consultations, and the EU Trade Commissioner's statements and related topics. That is the type of information that is available through the Commission that should be the benchmark for which our government presents information not only to Parliament but to civic society and interested groups across the country. It is in stark contrast, unfortunately, with the kind of information that the UK government has published to date. It is appropriate that we have information on the status of the discussions and highlighting areas where there are justifiably public differences in approach or policy between our government and other governments. The amendment is not asking for commercially sensitive information, nor is it asking for information which would diminish the ability of any negotiators carrying out a mandate that would be set or policy objectives that are agreed. It is necessary for the continuity areas of which we are in discussion. Also, we have unilaterally decided to engage in a different trading relationship with those who we have currently, with the possible addition of new tariff lines on goods which currently are not in place through the FTAs as we currently have, if there is no deal, as was referred to in the previous debate. The government seems to think that it is a rational approach to discuss with other countries that we, if there is a no-deal basis, and we're still seeking to have continuity agreements with those countries, to apply a new tariff regime with nearly 500 extra tariff lines to the businesses trading from those countries, whilst we are discussing with them to roll over an agreement of which we would reinstate zero tariffs that we currently enjoy with them by virtue of our membership of the European Union. It is a bizarre approach that the government seems to think will be beneficial, but it is just the latest in the approach of the government which has really stretched credulity. At the start of this bill process, the government said that the whole process of moving over agreements would be easy. Lord Price, the minister's predecessor, said that all countries had agreed to roll them over when they hadn't. Ministers said repeatedly that it would all be in place by the 29th of March, and many of us knew clearly that that would not happen. They denied that there was a problem when it was apparent to everyone there was one, and we knew that it wasn't going to happen for a number of reasons, but only after frustrated officials leaked information, the government demurred and published a one-off statement admitting a degree of reality. A one-off statement is now not sufficient, so we need to move away from this approach, and this amendment addresses a way forward. It means that a more informative position on our trading relationships with the countries we have an agreement with through the EU, but will end if we crash out. The amendment calls for an update on a weekly basis before we leave the EU, if we leave the EU, and then a monthly update which will form the basis of reporting until the texts of the agreements are shared with Parliament. Well, Lord, unless we have a consistent mechanism, we will have a rather bizarre approach that there will be two reporting systems from the government on the position of progress on continuity agreements and progress on successor on new agreements. It was the government's intention, for example, that Japan would be a continuity agreement and then there would be no reporting undertakings if that was the case. But now the Japanese have said they want it to be a successor agreement, of which will be covered by undertakings in the command paper. But the underlying policy intent has not changed. And there will be nothing to stop the discussions with a country on a continuity agreement, such as Canada or others, then becoming a successor agreement. And there will be two parallel systems of reporting. It isn't helpful for clarity and transparency. And finally, my Lord, we heard very clearly last week from Lord Kerr and others that those who have been at the highest level of negotiations on behalf of the UK, that greater transparency and involvement of Parliament to approve mandates actively strengthen the position of the UK, not weaken it. In order for Parliament to do its job right and engage with civil society groups and those with an interest in trade, or will be impacted by decisions made in negotiations, we need a high level of information on progress rather than simply a descriptor of, I quote, engagement ongoing in the statement of the 21st of February. And that is why I hope the Government will look favourably on this amendment, and if can't accept it, at least will establish some principles of which reporting mechanisms can be more up-to-date and more regular and a little bit more meaningful than simply a one-off publication in the 21st of February.
Yeah. I assume the noble lord would like to move his amendment. Amendment proposed after clause 5, insert the new clause as printed on the marshalled list.
My Lords, the noble Lord Purvis has outlined both the reasoning and the detail of this amendment. I intend, therefore, to be brief, as we have a number of amendments of even greater importance coming in soon. It's a shame that the Government won't accept this amendment or even work with the Lords on this side of the House to bring more detail and clarity to the reporting mechanisms and progress analysis of rollover agreements. Suffice to say, Her Majesty's Government are woefully behind on negotiating, securing and signing agreements that will need to be rolled over. Currently, only a handful of deals are close to completion. Ministers have admitted that they are struggling to make progress with the other trade agreements that Liam Fox has a number of times promised and said would be ready for the day after Brexit. These rollover agreements that we're dealing with just now, these rollover deals represent trade with approximately 70 countries, which constitute around about 13% of our exports and 12% of our imports. So far as we know, and that is telling, so far as we know, only 4 have been signed. 9 are off track, 19 are significantly off track, 4 are not possible to be completed before Brexit even, and 2 are not even being negotiated. The Government have refused to confirm how many separate and distinct agreements must be replicated to ensure the continuity of trade on existing terms. It is a sensible amendment allowing Parliament to have oversight of the process, and I fail to see how this would or could undermine our negotiating position as we move forward. If the noble Baroness, the Minister, is going to state that in her arguments that it would undermine our negotiating position, could she explain in detail how it would undermine that negotiating position? On this side, we're happy to support the amendment.
My Lords, I would like to thank the noble Lord Purvis of Tweed for tabling Amendment 23 and also the building upon it by Lord McNichol of West Kilbride. Can I begin by clarifying that the Government agrees with the spirit of this amendment, that providing updates on negotiations is necessary. It is fundamental to our approach that Parliament remains informed, and it is something that the Government has always sought and will continue to do. Your Lordships will, of course, recall that following concerns raised during committee stage of the bill in this House, the Government published a paper on the 28th of February which provided comprehensive proposals for the scrutiny of future free trade agreements. Many of your Lordships will also recall the debate last week on future trade agreements. The noble Lords, Lord Purvis of Tweed, Lord Stevenson of Balmacara and Lord Hannay of Chiswick tabled amendments which facilitated a full debate on scrutiny of future free trade agreements. In that debate, I again confirmed that for future free trade agreements, the government will publish its outline approach to negotiations, including objectives, and that this would be accompanied by a detailed economic analysis. And I think in terms of the EU reports to which the Noble Lord Purvis refers, these are on future EU agreements. We have committed to publishing both progress reports after each negotiating round and annual trade reports across all live trade negotiations. In terms of the Parliament's role in this, I confirm that the Government will work closely in future free trade agreements with the committee of both houses or a committee in each house, would provide information on a confidential basis to ensure that Parliament could scrutinise negotiations effectively from start to finish and throughout. In relation now to our trade continuity programme, which are the ones that are the subject of this amendment, your Lordships will be aware that the Government published a written ministerial statement on the 21st of February 2019, and this statement provided an update to Parliament on the status of all of those continuity agreements, and I hope clarified a number of the points that the Noble Lord Nicholl raised. I also trust that the Noble Lord Purvis would welcome the approach that the Government is taking of informing Parliament each and every time a continuity agreement is signed. 7 free trade agreements so far, and we will continue to take that approach. These agreements have been accompanied by signed or initialed. These agreements have been accompanied by a report outlining material changes between this agreement and the existing EU third country agreement. These reports provide important transparency and inform not just Parliament but businesses and consumers. And I think it is 3 of these agreements and the reports we will discuss later today. What may be some of your Lordships may not be aware of, however, is what Government has done over the last 6 months to keep Parliament informed more generally above that. For example, we have provided 5 oral evidence sessions to select committees by ministers or senior officials, 10 written updates to the International Trade Select Committee or the European Scrutiny Committee on Trade Agreement Continuity, answered 7 oral questions and 53 written parliamentary questions. I hope those elements are further tangible proof of the Government's commitment to keeping Parliament informed. However, while we agree, and the Government does agree with the intention of the Noble Lord Purvis's amendment, I am concerned that this obligation in statute could have unintended consequences of making it more difficult to keep Parliament informed. The Noble Lord McNicholl asked, what are the issues? It's the kind of obligations which might arise when we are in the middle of negotiations with our partner countries. For example, if we were to say that an agreement discussion was progressing well and that all of the key issues had been addressed, we think that might cause a negotiating issue on the other side. Equally, if we said we thought it was performing poorly or there were issues, that might again expose issues that our partner countries were ill-prepared to do. If negotiations are going badly, a public statement to that effect would likely prejudice them further, resulting, we believe, in a worse outcome for the UK. So our approach is to provide Parliament with as much information as we can, consistent with managing those risks. It genuinely is about getting the balance right between openness and transparency with Parliament and managing often delicate international negotiations. I trust that the Noble Lord Purvis, takes reassurance from this explanation, and most importantly from our continued commitment to ensure that Parliament is kept up to date in relation to the Trade Agreement Continuity Programme. I would therefore respectfully ask the Noble Lord to withdraw his amendment.
For the Minister's response and for the support of Lord McNicholl, he highlighted that we are likely only to have seen 13% of UK exports represented in the agreements that we have. So there's quite a long way to go. And then the issue then is a one-off statement that was published going to be sufficient? But I very much take on board what the Minister said about the other areas of which there is that ongoing engagement with Parliament, and that's to be welcomed. It is also welcome that in the command paper that the Government is committed to publish material and also have the ongoing dialogue both in public and in private with committees that could well be established. And I hope very much that that dialogue will also involve the discussions about what type of information is appropriate to be released into the public domain and the timely fashion that is the case. On the basis of the comments from the Minister and the fact that if we are to be securing the information that I think that we do need on the continuity agreements, we will continue to be persistent on the written questions and on the opportunities in Parliament. But on this basis, I beg leave to withdraw the amendment.
Shall the amendment be withdrawn? The amendment is by leave withdrawn. Amendment 24, the Lord Fox.
I rise to move Amendment 24, which is in my name. But, my Lords, during the debate in the report stage, your Lordship has already voted through an amendment that creates a process for Parliament's involvement in setting a mandate for future trade deals and for helping to approve the final deal. Separately, your Lordships has made clear a strong preference for the UK remaining in the Customs Union. In part, this amendment is the third part of that and is intended to set the scene for the long-term future relationship between this country and the EU. And I'm grateful to the noble Baroness Bull and the Earl of Clancarty for their support in this amendment. This amendment sets out an objective for future EU trade deal, a mandate to include a mobility framework that enables all UK and EU citizens to exercise the same reciprocal rights to work, live and study for the provision of trade and goods in services. The reciprocal nature of this recognises one important fact. Without allowing or enabling EU 27 people to work and trade in the United Kingdom, we will have no such rights for UK people in the EU. By voting for this amendment, your Lordships will be creating the best possible chance for talented men and women in the UK to work and continue to work and offer their services within the EU 27. And, of course, it's a win-win. On the other side of such an arrangement, we will continue to welcome people into this country who contribute positively to our economy and our social fabric. Their skills make a positive difference. My Lords, during the committee stage and at some length, I outlined, according to the Government's own advisory people, the role and the positive role that people from the 27 other EU countries play in this economy. You'll be relieved to know that I won't be replaying those arguments today, in part because in no measure were those facts challenged during that debate in committee stage. There has been a net benefit to the UK from the activities of EU 27 citizens here. The speech also acknowledged that issues were thrown up by migration in some communities and that these issues were not sufficiently recognised and sufficiently dealt with by successive UK governments. But, my Lord, the benefits of those EU citizens working in the UK were also insufficiently recognised publicly by successive governments. During the committee, and speaking during the summation, the opposition frontbench spokesman, Lord Stevenson, spoke about the appearance rather than the reality of unbridled immigration. And that refers back to the point that I was just making. But, my Lords, whilst recognising that this perception is very important and recognising that governments have to do things about it, we should not be put off from doing the right thing and supporting this amendment. Because I hope that by supporting this amendment, we all demonstrate the value that we place on the mutual agreement that we can have and the mutual opportunities that we can create for our people, for our businesses and for our communities. As for the government, well, I didn't notice during the committee stage a great warming to my argument, although I always foster hopes. But I would appeal over the heads of the front bench for your Lordship's House to see the value in this amendment. Supporting this amendment is a major step to setting out the mandate for UK negotiators. It signals what sort of country we want to live in And, my lords, it does reject one of Mrs May's red lines. Opposing this amendment, or indeed sitting on your hands, panders to the false picture of the role of immigration in our society, and it will impair the UK in so many ways, not least in trade. I move Amendment 24.
Brilliant. Clause 5, insert the new clause as printed on the marshalled list.
Lords, I've added my name to this amendment because I believe it's vitally important to preserve mobility rights and in doing so protect some of the UK's most productive sectors. I've noted before the relative silence on trade in services in the Brexit conversation. Attention's been focused on the at-the-border issues associated with trade rather than the more complex behind-the-borders issues, domestic rules, regulations and qualifications which are germane to trade in services. And this silence, as I've said before, is particularly hard to understand given services' contribution to the UK, over 40% of total exports, 80% of the UK's GDP, and they account for 4 in 5 jobs across the country. The largest single destination for UK services is, of course, the EU, worth £90 billion annually. But if services have been treated like the second son, mobility has been the Cinderella of the story, pushed from the start to the wrong side of what some of us see as a wrong-headed red line. And there is, of course, an inextricable link between mobility and services. Services provided in this country, such as tourism or higher education, depend on inward mobility. Service packages linked to goods, maintenance contracts, they depend on outward mobility. And services delivered in the consumer's country are often provided on a fly-in, fly-out basis, and the scale of this trade is significant. The CBI reports that employees of just one firm undertook 17,000 trips to the UK, from the UK to the EU, and 10,000 in the opposite direction in just a single year. And of course, the complex interdependencies between services, goods and people are exemplified in the outputs of the creative and cultural sectors, and I make no apologies for mentioning this once again today. The creative industries are responsible for 10% of the UK service exports. They're creating jobs at 4 times the rate of the wider economy, and they contribute a staggering £101 billion in GVA each year. And of course, their success has been achieved on the back of the freedom to move people and kit across borders without visas, carnets and tariffs, and to bring in talent as and when needed, and often at ridiculously short notice from the EU. In the most economically productive parts of the sector, domestic skills gaps mean that up to 30% of staff are recruited from the EU, and continued mobility post-Brexit is the creative industry's #1 priority. Finally, I do want to mention the 1.5 million low and medium-skilled jobs in the UK which are currently filled by EU workers. There are a vast number of business sectors relying on this supply stream, and it's for vital roles in teaching, healthcare and social care. And we already have workforce shortages, and requirements that are only going to increase. It's estimated we'll need an extra 650,000 care workers by 2035 to look after our ageing population. With virtual full employment in the UK at the moment, it's not clear where these workers will come from. My Lords, I know there are differing opinions in this chamber on the public's views on mobility, and indeed there are differing public views, as noted already by the noble Lord Fox. But can we focus for a moment on the facts, as contained in the Migration Advisory Committee's report? No evidence that immigration impacts on employment outcomes nor on wages, and immigrants, as we've heard, contribute more to health and social care services than they consume. And finally, let's not forget, mobility works in 2 ways. This amendment would not only protect the UK services sector, the jobs it provides, and the tax revenues that it generates, it would also preserve the rights to travel, work, learn and trade across borders, rights which all the research shows are the foremost concerns of young people today. I also urge other noble lords to support this amendment.
My Lords, I have put my name to this important amendment, and I will speak briefly about the services aspect of this amendment in relation to the free movement. My Lords, the recent no-deal impact statement says that free movement of people support services. It would be more correct to say that free movement is intrinsic to services. This is certainly true of the creative industries, but it is true of many other areas of the services sector as well. As a British IT worker has said, we freelancers export ourselves. As the Noble Lord Fox said at committee stage, trade is people. Yet despite their massive importance, and the Noble Baroness has given us the figures, the services sector is, as Sir Ivan Rogers said at the University of Liverpool in December, the dog that has largely failed to bark, an observation that the Noble Lord Stevenson also made at committee stage. And services continue not to bark. This is deeply worrying. My Lords, Brexit, of course, has not yet happened, and it may still not do so, but it is happening now for British workers who provide services in Europe, whom one is tempted to call the canaries in the mine, except that we are talking about the endangering of people's livelihoods. More and more reports are coming in of projects put on hold, of individual freelancers being told that unless they have a European passport, don't bother to apply for the job, and this irrespective of the level of qualifications they possess. It is becoming a precondition. For many European companies, it will make no difference what kind of Brexit we end up with if it is a Brexit without free movement. My Lords, I will urge the Minister to look at a video blog recorded in English by an IT agency based in Rotterdam, doing the rounds of the social media, which makes it clear that if you are not in Europe, then neither the agency nor their clients can work with you. Europe, of course, meaning the single market. The impact statement says that the effects on services will be mitigated by a reciprocal mobility framework. Yet the reality will be that the mobility of British workers abroad will be restricted by the severity of the immigration policy outlined in the White Paper and coming our way in the immigration bill, a policy which completely ignores the effect it will have on our service industries, on British workers working in Europe. As Sir Ivan Rogers said, UK services industries have been sacrificed to the primary goal of ending free movement. My Lords, the amendment also refers to study. Unless we have free movement, I am pessimistic about our membership of Erasmus Plus beyond 2020. Look at what happened to Switzerland, which was thrown out of Erasmus when the referendum voted against free movement. After a new agreement, I believe that Switzerland is now back. My Lords, there are many important reasons for supporting this amendment. From the point of view of trade, it should be supported not just to protect our valuable trade and services, and indeed also to protect the increasingly important servitisation aspect of manufacturing, but importantly to protect British workers and British jobs.
So I haven't participated on this subject before, but I've listened to the Noble Lord Fox's persuasive explanation. I noticed the phrase mobility framework, which sounds incredibly friendly. But I have to tell you, I'm going to urge my noble friend to reject this amendment. I'm going to do so not because I want to build a wall, nor because I think the perceptions of immigration have been wholly erroneous, and that he drew the committee's House's attention to that. That's quite right. The Noble Baroness Bull said we need to talk about facts. This is just a couple of facts, and I will only take a minute, my lords. The population of the United Kingdom is going up by 1,200 a day. That's 400 from natural increase, 600 from immigration from outside the EU, and 200 from immigration within the EU. So we're putting a small town, large village, on the map of the UK every week. The ONS projections are that the country's population will go up between 7 and 9 million between now and 2040. Manchester currently has 2.5 million people living in it. So we're going to have to find homes for 3 cities the size of Manchester. The UK will, by that stage, have overtaken Germany as the most populous country in Europe, and England will have overtaken the Netherlands as the most densely populated. And that is against the background of an industrial revolution that is believed to be going to cause 7.5 million jobs, either to be lost or to be radically altered. All I would say to the Noble Lord Fox, and I quite understand his wish, and I understand the wishes of the other movers of this amendment, this has to be looked at in the round of our demographic future. It's not about whether you've been here recently, it's not about your colour, your race, your creed. It is what is going to enable our society to operate cohesively and well as we see that scale of arrivals and we see that scale of change in the way we live and work.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt the noble lord, but how can his argument work when at the moment we've got unemployment at almost 4%, and we need 3.5 million people from the European Union over here now, and with an immigration white paper that says a minimum salary has to be £30,000, and what the noble Lady Bull has said, and the Earl Conclati, how will we manage, with a slow-growing economy of just over 1% a year, let alone if we would grow faster, we'll have an acute labour shortage?
I've just told the noble lord, I think he's completely wrong. I've explained that we look as though we shall lose 7.5 million jobs because of the Industrial Revolution, the Fourth Industrial Revolution. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there is drastic underemployment in people aged over 50. If you find people trying to get jobs aged over 50, they can't get them. They can't get them because it is seen that they are only got a few years to work, and they're not reliable, and youth is the thing people look for. So there is plenty of available people of older, and jobs are going to disappear. And that is why I could not support this amendment unless we'd done a lot more work on what the noble Lord Fox's mobility framework really meant.
My Lord, I wonder if I could depart for a moment from the beauty of facts into perhaps more abstract philosophy. We've heard about movement of people in terms of the creative industries, and I think there's one very important point to make here. And I look back over a career that's taken me from being a chorister at the Royal Academy of Music to working in the BBC, working at Royal Opera House, working with orchestras, working with dancers, with singers. And in every one of those cases, there was a very important contribution made from the movement of people. Now, I think one of the most important aspects of intellect and civilization, and I think many of the ministers on the front bench here would aspire to these things. One of the most important aspects of intellect is curiosity. Now, to experience the best aspects of curiosity, you need freedom of movement, freedom of ideas, freedom to travel. And I would just simply say that my life has been staggeringly enriched. I'm privileged at the way it has been enriched by the movement of people. My ability to go to a concert next month where my music is being done in Vienna, one in Budapest, people coming here to perform from whom I have learnt so much. People like George Ligeti, Witold Lutosławski, who I studied with. This movement of ideas and curiosity is vital to the intellectual and cultural health of our nation.
Intention at all of intervening in this debate other than entirely to support the motion, but I must make the point to Lord Hodgson because he's raised it. What we've been hearing from him is all too familiar. 120 years ago, when my mother's family came to this country, Jewish immigrants from Russia, exactly the same charges were being made about this flood, this literal flood of Jewish immigrants coming into a country and potentially destabilising it and making it a more difficult place to live in. Is there anyone in this House that thinks that that generation of Jewish immigrants did anything other than contribute massively to the wealth and prosperity of this country? It's an absurd argument. It's trotted out every 100 years, I'm afraid, I have to say, from his benches, and yet it is always fallacious, and in the end, frankly, very, very upsetting and disturbing.
Well, Lords, at the heart of this amendment is a concern that the necessary steps are taken to ensure that when the trade that we have, which involves the use of services, which increasingly spreads across not simply dealing with performance or with artistic or cultural issues, but is also integrally part of the work that we do in making cars, machinery and everything else, because the expertise and knowledge that goes with that. involves people who need to explore that, need to accompany the work they're doing in a way which allows it to work and function properly. If they are prevented from moving, then we as a society will suffer. So in addition to the very well-made points from the crossbenchers in terms of the artistic and cultural level, there's a purely practical arrangement of the new technologies which the Lord Hodgson referred to being unable to be worked if we don't have the services available to make them work. And I wish him well with his iPad when it collapses if we can't get the people to service it because they are unable to travel. But more seriously, my lords, the fourth pillar of the GATS treaty, to which we are already members through EU and would be members if we come out of the EU, requires countries such as the UK in its independence, if it was that way, to make sure that there are ways in which services are delivered which include the ability to provide rights for working, living and studying. And although studying doesn't necessarily seem to apply to the right to work and live, it's a very important aspect for us in Britain, because one of our biggest export earners is, of course, our educational services. And if we are preventing, as we would be if we don't have a proper arrangement for that, people to travel in order to provide the facilities under which study and the ability to pass on knowledge is available, then we will suffer enormously as a result of that. My lords, I was at a meeting last night involving the universities organised by the Industry and Parliament Trust. The palpable concern being felt by all the academics present about the inability to engage with Erasmus and Erasmus+, the possibility that the Horizon 2020 funds will not be available, the lack of technical support to support the research activity because the salary level grades were too high, the inability to attract good postgraduate students in order to provide the intermediate work in research teams but also to do teaching, was going to mean considerable changes in our university systems. This is the implication if we do not have a mobility framework of the type expressed in this arrangement, and I support it.
My Lords, can I thank Noble Lord for moving this amendment for Fox. I think probably before I sort of respond to it, I should declare an interest in that my wife came from outside the EU to this country and has made a contribution over the last 30 years in building a business and making contributions in other ways. So I have no problem in, as I was invited to recognising the tremendous contributions which are made to this country by the people who come to make this place their home and to contribute to it. And in the same spirit also to specifically recognise the contribution that our European friends have made to this country in many of the areas which have been referenced already. The government is committed to securing the best deal for UK businesses. The white paper on our future relationship set out a clear proposal for an ambitious future relationship with the European Union, including a reciprocal framework for mobility. The government recognises the need to ensure that we have sufficient mobility provisions with the EU to support our trade agreement and that we implement an immigration system that works in the national interest, as my old friend Lord Hodgson sought. The reciprocal framework for mobility that the government is seeking to agree with the EU will include provisions to support businesses, to provide services and to move their talented people, to provide visa-free travel for short visits, including tourists and business travels and students, as the Noble Lord Berkeley contributed and talked us, spoke to us about the value that brings. This was reflected in the political declaration on our future relationship. The detail of these provisions will be discussed in future negotiations. The government will continue to engage extensively with businesses, researchers, trade bodies, universities, and the Noble Lord Stevenson, Baroness Bull referred to, including specifically on elements of a framework for mobility. Following the publication of its white paper, the Home Office has launched an extensive programme of targeted engagement across the UK as it develops the future immigration system. The government is engaging with sectors and with regions of England and the nations to communicate its proposals and to understand their priorities for a future system. This amendment would restrict the government's ability to set the UK's negotiating position for the future detailed negotiations on our relationship with the EU. In so doing, the amendment risks undermining the government's ability to come to come to the best possible agreement with our European partners as we negotiate our future economic partnership. Moreover, the trade bill is not designed or intended to deal with the future relationship with the EU, but rather with our future trade agreements with global partners outside the EU. In some of the questions, let me just turn to those which the Noble Earl Lord Clancarty referred to. Lord Bilbermoria and Lord Stevenson spoke about what happens about UK participation in Erasmus after Brexit. The UK has committed to participating in Erasmus Plus until the end of 2020, when the EU's current budget framework ends. The political declaration sets out the basis for cooperation in union programmes, subject to the conditions set out in the corresponding union instruments, such as science and innovation, culture and education, development, defence capabilities, civil protection and space. The UK welcomes the EU's proposals for the 2021-2027 successor scheme to Erasmus+, which was published on the 30th of May 2018, and would like to discuss the detailed arrangements for third country participation with the EU. Lord Fox asserted that reciprocity is essential, as is mentioned in the amendment itself. The agreement sets out in the political declaration on mobility the government is seeking reciprocity between the UK and the EU. So where the UK takes a commitment, the EU will need to do likewise. Baroness Bull asked about the importance of the EU for immigration, particularly of medium skilled and low skilled, if one may refer to the carers example in that sort of rather blunt. Anybody who's had any experience of dealing with a carer, you want to put them at the most highly skilled people on the planet, but in the context of earnings, which is one measure that the Migration Advisory Committee uses. The future immigration system will support the UK economy to access the talent it needs. The skills threshold will be reduced to include medium-skilled workers too. As a transitional measure, we will introduce a route for temporary short-term workers of all skill levels. This will cater for the seasonal and low-skilled workers, short-term workers undertaken across the European Union currently. There will be, of course, other opportunities for the Noble Lord of Fox to press this point. There will be an immigration bill which will be coming for your Lordship's price. There is a white paper, and I appeal to Noble Lords to reflect on whether this perhaps is the appropriate vehicle and the appropriate time in order to press this amendment. And with those points, I would ask the Noble Lord to consider withdrawing this amendment.
My Lords, I'd like to congratulate those peers who've taken part in this debate, and I think Baroness Bull, the Earl of Clancarty, Lord Berkeley and Lord Putnam all forcefully put the moral as well as the economic case behind this amendment. I'd like to thank Lord Hodgson for mentioning the Industrial Revolution. If we are to build a significant piece of a place in that industry in the world, as the government's industrial strategy seeks to achieve, it won't be by closing the borders and stopping people from coming in and giving us the value of their services, their knowledge and their ability to build it. This will be a global exercise. If we want to lead in it, we have to fling open our doors and let those people into this country. The Minister, of course, put a persuasive case around the proposals for the proposed regime. In essence, we're taking the regime that has been applied to non-EU migrants and putting it onto EU migrants. I have to tell you that having worked in companies that have sought to bring people in to this country to do important jobs, it's an extremely difficult process. By making it harder for our closest allies and our biggest market to bring people in is not a solution to this problem. The Minister is right to say that there may be other opportunities to put this point, but I'm someone who likes to seize the day, so I would beg to seek the opinion of the House on this.
Yeah. The question is that Amendment 24 be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Yeah.
The contrary, not content?
Not content.
Clear the bar. My Lords, there have voted contents 254, not contents 187. So the contents have it. Amendment 24A, the Lord Stevenson of Balmacara.
My Lords, those with a particularly keen eyesight will have noticed that this is an amended version of an earlier amendment which was laid at committee stage, and it reflects the fact that we have been in discussion with the government on how best to frame an important issue, which is that there should be placed on a duty on the Secretary of State in this case, but the government more generally, to ensure that if we are in a situation where we are negotiating international trade agreements with the EU, in other words, not in a no-deal crash-out situation, then there is an obligation on the United Kingdom to try and cooperate as closely as possible with bodies that are listed in the list. And in moving Amendment 24A, may I draw attention to Amendment 25A, which I regard as consequential, since it is the removal of the clause which is intended to 24A is intended to replace. My Lords, you could, I think, trace the thinking about this back to the amendment moved in the other place at the time the bill was being considered at report stage in the Commons, which inserted into the bill a requirement that the Secretary of State seeks an appropriate authority in this case, but I think it is the Secretary of State, to negotiate an international trade agreement in the EU, which includes working closely with the European Medicines Agency, but stopped at that point. That raises, in my mind, and I'm sure in others, why other agencies and bodies of equal importance across a range of issues in the economy before us shouldn't also be the subject of close negotiation. And therefore, I thought it would be appropriate to bring forward an amendment at this stage which tried to raise some of those. I also noticed that in the Chequers statement and the white paper that followed that, there was in fact a much longer list of bodies that were thought to be appropriate in any future negotiated international trade agreement with the EU, which didn't appear in the original list but could well be considered. And I also discovered that the CBI were very keen to make sure that the government had its attention drawn to the fact that, in the CBI's view, the future relationship with the EU would suffer tremendously if there wasn't a considerable effort given to approach bodies such as the European Medicines Agency, but including the Aviation Safety Agency, the Maritime Safety Agency, the network of transmission systems operators in the same manner. So the version before you, I think, perhaps doesn't still catch the full attention of the government, but I have hopes that when she comes to respond, the Noble Baroness, the Minister, when he comes to respond, the Noble Lord, the Minister, might have a suggestion in mind that we work further on this to make sure that we have an agreed position before we get to third reading, and if so, I'd be very happy to work with the government on that. He will probably raise the question of why F and G, the European Food Safety Authority and the European Union Intellectual Property Office, are on my list, but perhaps wouldn't reach the criteria that are going to be raised by the government. I'd be interested to hear his arguments on this, because it seems to me that many members of your Lordship's House would think that the European Food Safety Authority met all the criteria of the others in the list. And indeed, if we are to make a future of our economy in the new modern world, we're certainly going to need to work closely with the European Union Intellectual Property Office, which has a very high reputation for all the work that's involved in trying to regulate and bring forward arrangements for the new technologies. I beg to move.
Amendment proposed, after Clause 5, insert the new clause as printed on the marshalled list.
My Lords, can I thank the Noble Lord for presenting his amendment, and particularly thank him for the way that he's engaged with officials and with my noble friend Baroness Fairhead on this important issue. I feel that, sort of, to cut to the chase, we're probably not going to be that far apart on this, but let me put some remarks on the record in the hope that, that perhaps we could agree to keep working on this. between now and third reading. Ministers from across government have carried out an extensive engagement on the EU exit with businesses, industry bodies and civil society organisations from all sectors of the economy in all regions of the UK. The Secretaries of State for DEXU, BEIS and the Chancellor's Exchequer co-chair the EU exit Business Advisory Group to ensure business is not only heard but influential throughout our negotiations. The group involves the Director Generals of the CBI, the IOD, the EEF, the BCC and FSB. These meetings happen regularly and are included in transparency returns. DEXU ministers alone have organised and attended more than 500 engagements with business and civil society stakeholders from every sector of the British economy since July 2016. For goods, the UK and the EU want to be as ambitious as possible. As part of this, both parties have agreed to explore the possibility of UK cooperation with EU agencies such as the European Aviation Safety Agency, the European Chemicals Agency and the European Medicines Agency. In addition, the political declaration sets out that the UK will also seek to cooperate with the European Maritime Safety Agency and the European Network of Transmission System Operators. As a specific example of this suggested cooperation in the interests of tackling shared safety and security issues, we will continue cooperating with the European Maritime Safety Agency, including exchange of information between the agency and the United Kingdom Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. Let me turn to the core issue that I think remains between us, and that is the position of the EU Intellectual Property Office. The government is working to find the best arrangement for the UK regarding the EU agencies and bodies, but the decision to seek cooperation with an EU agency or body must be made carefully in consideration, bearing in mind the context of the UK's overall aims for the future relationship and negotiations with the EU. As we negotiate our future relationship with the EU, the government is determined to agree on ambitious provisions to help business protect their intellectual property rights. Indeed, the political declaration in the UK and the EU commit to establishing, and I quote, a mechanism for cooperation and exchange of information on intellectual property issues of mutual interest. In this regard, the UK would seek an appropriate level of cooperation with the EU and other relevant agencies, such as EU IPO. What we can achieve will be subject to the negotiations. However, since intellectual property is a wide-ranging and dynamic area of law, it would be unwise to stipulate in UK law exactly how we want to cooperate with the EU in this given area, as the implications could have wider implications for the balance of rights and obligations in the future partnership. Whatever the outcome of the negotiations, I'd like to reassure Noble Lord Stevenson that trademarks and registered designs are granted on a non-discriminatory basis. That means that in all circumstances, British businesses will continue to be able to use the EU Intellectual Property Office to protect their trademarks and designs in the EU. The government wants to emphasise that we want to be ambitious and we want to obtain the best result possible in the negotiations with the EU on intellectual property. However, as it stands, the amendment would be unhelpful to bind the UK to a particular negotiation approach. Negotiation objectives are complex and they are vitally important questions which must be weighed in their own right. In accordance with the commitments the Prime Minister has made, Parliament will have greater and a more formal role in the development of the mandate for the next phase of negotiations. The government are more than sympathetic both to the Noble Lord Stevenson Balcara's concerns and to the concerns of businesses. Thorough engagement with stakeholders and with the EU has led the UK to saying it will seek cooperation with 5 bodies I mentioned previously. This work requires thorough and weighted consideration of how active participation in an agency delivers wider negotiation goals in the context of any associated costs and disbenefits. I thank the Noble Lord for his constructive approach to engagement in this. I believe we are not far apart from each other, particularly in the light of progress we have made to date. Consequently, as throughout the process, I can confirm that I and my noble friend, the lead minister, Baroness Fairhead, will be happy to have further discussions to see whether we can reach a mutually acceptable agreement and we can therefore return to this at third reading. And on that basis, I would ask the Noble Lord to consider withdrawing his amendment.
I thank the Noble Lord the Minister very much for his very considerate words and for dealing in detail with some of the issues that I raised in my opening statement. With his agreement to look to see if we can work further over the next few days in order to get a common agreement on a wording that could be brought back at third reading, I'm happy to withdraw my amendment.
Is your Lord declares this amendment be withdrawn? Amendment be withdrawn. Amendment 25 being withdrawn. In clause 6, Amendment 25A, Lord Stevenson, not moved. After clause 6, Amendment 26, Baroness Fairhead.
My Lords, we have talked at length about the purpose of the Government's Trade Continuity Programme, which is seeking continuity of the effects of existing EU free trade agreements as far as possible as we leave the EU. The vast majority of these existing trade agreements, which we are part of as an EU member state, are already in operation within the UK and have been scrutinised by Parliament. Let me make very clear to the House that, as part of this programme, we do not expect to need to change existing domestic equalities legislation. In the unlikely event that we need to make minor or consequential changes to this legislation, we will aim to ensure that this does not result in reduced protection against unlawful discrimination or diminution of equality rights. However, as indicated at committee stage, to ensure suitable transparency and accountability on this particularly important issue, the Government has worked closely with the Equality and Human Rights Commission to develop this amendment. Specifically, Amendment 26 provides for a ministerial statement to be made before any regulations are laid under the Clause 2 power to implement a continuity trade agreement. This statement will outline whether those regulations modify any provision of the Equality Acts 2006 and 2012, or any subordinate legislation made under those enactments. This is in addition to the reports that Parliament will receive under clauses 3 and 5, setting out any significant differences between continuity agreements and the corresponding original EU agreements. My Lords, I trust that this House can accept this as further evidence that the Government has a strong desire to be transparent with Parliament, businesses and the general public about its continuity programme. My Lords, I beg to move.
Amendment proposed to insert the new clause as printed on the martial list.
My Lords, very briefly, we on this side support this amendment and are pleased to see the Government committed to protect equalities legislation. However, I've liked to see the Government go a little bit further and give a greater promise that trade agreements will not allow any regression of standards at all as we move forward. With that, there's nothing else further I need to add.
My Lords, I thank the Noble Lord McNichol of West Kilbride for his support. As I think the House is aware, we are trying to work on the standards to agree a mutually acceptable form of words. May I just conclude by placing on the record my thanks for the positive engagement that the Government has had with the Equality and Human Rights Commission in relation to this amendment. We have worked closely together on developing it, and as the House would have seen from the Commission's briefing, it too is supportive of this amendment. Consequently, I hope that my Lords will support, their Lordships will support this amendment, and I beg to move.
Question is this amendment be agreed to? As many as are that will say content.
Content.
Colin, not content. The contents have it. In clause 7, Amendment 27, Baroness Fairhead.
My Lords, I rise as batsman number 3 today, and this group of amendments cover amendments 27, 28, 29, 30 and 36 to 58. I will speak to Government Amendments 27, 29, 30 and 36 to 58, which are minor technical amendments. I will then respond to Amendment 28, tabled by the Noble Lords Lord Stevenson of Balmacara and the Noble Lord Purvis of Tweed, after they have spoken to their amendment. My Lords, to avoid the unnecessary duplication of a provision already in place by virtue of the EU Withdrawal Act, Amendment 27 removes Clause 7.2. Clause 7.2 allows for devolved administrations to make regulations under Section 1.1 or 2.1 of the Trade Bill before exit day, provided that those regulations do not come into effect until exit day. This is already provided for by the EU Withdrawal Act, which applies this principle to all bills passed after the EU Withdrawal Act in the same session of Parliament. There will be no change to policy with the removal of Clause 7.2. It merely removed an unnecessary and duplicative provision. My Lords, for the bill to work in the way that it is intended, the definition of subordinate legislation must include acts passed in devolved legislatures as well as in the UK Parliament. This is possible by changing the definition of subordinate legislation from that used in the Interpretation Act of 1978 to the more detailed one used in the EU Withdrawal Act. This is the purpose of Amendment 29, which ensures that, where possible, the provisions in the bill respect the important role of the devolved administrations. Turning to Amendments 30 and 36, Clause 8.6 in Part 1 of the bill sets out a list of definitions of terms found in the bill, such as what a devolved authority means. Amendments 30 and 36 would move the definition of domestic law from Schedule 1, paragraph 2.7, to Clause 8.6, where it will sit alongside other definitions that relate to the devolved administrations. This will make the bill easier for people to follow. Turning to Amendments 37 to 43 and 45 to 58, Schedule 1 to the Trade Bill allows for joint procedure requirements that derive from outside of the Trade Bill still to apply to regulations made under Clauses 1 and 2 of the Trade Bill. By inserting the phrase acting alone to appropriate places in Schedules 1 and 2, as Amendments 37 to 43 and 45 to 58 seek to do, we are improving the quality of the legislation by clarifying when the devolved authorities are acting alone as opposed to acting jointly with the UK Government. Amendment 44 ensures that paragraph 6.4 of Schedule 1 works as intended by applying consultation requirements that would otherwise bind Northern Ireland devolved authorities to regulations made under Clause 1.1 and 2.1. These changes are technical in order to tidy up the bill, and as such I hope that your Lordships will support them.
Amendment proposed, page 5, line 15, leave out subsection 2.
My Lords, I think it's a test of the abilities of ministers to be able to breathe life into a list such as that which we've just heard, which of course is drafting amendments beyond the border threshold of many people who have to sit through these debates. And I congratulate the Noble Viscount, for his ability to do that well. And I have no objections to the points he's made, and I will indeed support them enthusiastically when asked to do so. In this group, which has got a lot of one-line amendments, there is this rather large amendment dealing with conventions relating to the Sewell, well, it relates to the Sewell Convention, which has been operating for a number of years in relation to devolved matters in the assemblies in Scotland, parliaments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland when it meets. It's there because there is concern that the government has still not really bottomed out its arrangements for how all such matters are to be dealt with going forward. And while there is no complaint that the convention has worked well up until now, conventions are conventions, and there is an argument, at least in principle, that at some point, either now or at some later stage, there should be an attempt to try to clarify quite clearly what the rules are, how it operates, and the conditions under which it exists. And I say that particularly because there remains a continuing concern about the way in which the government attempted to legislate in the withdrawal bill in relation to matters particularly relating to matters being devolved, as it might be under any agreement with the EU, or if we crash out, to the UK, but for which there is a strong and persuasive case that these matters should go direct to the devolved administrations. In those circumstances, a great deal of work has been done, and a lot of the individual issues that were raised have been settled one way or the other, but there still remain a list of bodies for which, of subject matters in relation to devolved issues which need to be resolved so that where they intersect with other geographical locations, there is a workable scheme under which progress can be made. And the issue that arose at that stage was the extent to which the devolution legislation passed by this House in order to set up these bodies could be invoked in issues where the issue concerned involved who had the authority to legislate where a matter was devolved. If a matter is not reserved under the Act, it is devolved, and therefore matters which fall to be devolved need to have must have consent of the body under the Civil Convention to which the issue is devolved. I'm putting this simply, there's a more complex arrangement. But in the case that we've got before us today, we felt that trade being such an important issue, there should be some measure put into this bill which explained exactly the conditions under which the Convention would operate and the extent to which it would and would not be concerned. So the wording there is quite clear. Ministers of the Crown may not normally make provision which would be within the devolved competence of a devolved authority unless the minister's consent, and goes on to say that it would normally be within the devolved competencies of the devolved authority, and there are conditions under that. And it applies to all areas. My Lords, that would have been a very simple introduction to a very simple issue for which I would expect the Minister to respond. However, it will not have escaped the House that in another bill, the Healthcare International Arrangements Bill, only yesterday, a very similar amendment, Amendment 15, was moved by Baroness Mansour on behalf of the government, which covered almost exactly the same territory. And it is phrased in a positive sense in the way that the amendment before this House today is in a negative sense, but it covers precisely the same ground. It says, before making regulations that contain provisions which are within the legislative competence of a devolved legislature, the Secretary of State must consult the relevant authority on that provision, and then goes on to explain the conditions under which operate. Now, the wording is not identical, but I would argue today that the sensibility behind this and the principles involved are identical to the amendment before your Lordship's House. So my question for the Noble Lord the Minister does he recognise that to the extent that the government has already considered this issue and legislated for it, it may be in the best interest of the government to accept the Amendment 28 before them today, since to do otherwise might cause difficulty for that which has already been passed in the Healthcare International Arrangements Bill and is now part of that bill. Alternatively, would he consider agreeing to meet with me and discuss with this and other interested members of your Lordship's House in order that we come back at third reading with a wording which is consistent with that which is already now in law, or will be soon in law in the Healthcare International Arrangements Bill, and is appropriate for the Trade Bill? I beg to move.
My Lords, I also speak to Amendment 28, which I've added my name to. And there isn't really much to add from the very persuasive case of Lord Stevenson. I welcome the Minister. He's always assured a decrease, even if he's a third batsman. And his clarification on some of the areas with regards to Ministers of the Crown acting jointly with devolved ministers is helpful. It's always been something that has been a bit of a puzzle for me within Schedule 2, Section 3, Clause 3 of that, when it comes to the joint working of the two sets of ministers, but his clarifications have been helpful. As Lord Stevenson pointed out, we have had discussions in committee concerning the areas of interaction where devolved and reserved competences either align themselves clearly, or there is dispute as to where they fall, whether they are fully within the devolved competences of the Welsh Parliament or the Scottish Parliament, or are reserved issues. When we discussed the Withdrawal Act, there were a series that were put forward by the government of all of the different policy areas that would be repatriated from European Union legislation. There 49 of them there had been no issue. 82 areas that was recognised that a common framework was needed between the UK and devolved administrations. But there were 24 where the government said there were to be further discussion, and 12 areas where there was no agreement, 12 areas where the UK believed were reserved, but the devolved administrations believed that these were fully within the devolved competences, and particularly the Scottish Parliament. Why this is important on the Trade Bill is that those 12 policy areas include eco-design and energy labelling, elements of product safety and standards, elements of network and information security directive, environmental quality, data sharing, food geographical indications, medical devices, state aid issues. And all of those aspects are likely to be covered both in continuity trade agreements and new trade agreements. So unless this is an issue where there is a degree of resolution, then this is likely to lock in perpetual constitutional friction between the consideration of whether they are devolved or reserved. The amendment is a very reasonable amendment to establish within this bill that the practices that we have adopted in statute elsewhere is also reflected clearly when it comes to trade negotiations. In the Scotland Act 2016, Clause 2 states, and I quote the Sewell Convention, in Section 28 of the Scotland Act 1998, Act of the Scottish Parliament, but it is recognised that the Parliament of the United Kingdom will not normally legislate with regard to devolved matters without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. This is now a convention which is underpinned by statute in devolution acts. What we are simply asking for is the same level of protections that would come when it comes to the regulations arising from trade agreements are provided with exactly the same kind of protection that exists within the Scotland Act 2016. And the implications of the continuity agreements and the regulations that will come from that, and indeed the new trade agreements, are important. So it would be most helpful if the Minister could update the House as to where the current level of the discussions are with regards to those areas. We know that from the correspondence to the Lord Speaker from the Scottish Government that there is continuing disagreement, but it didn't go into much detail as to where those areas are. So if the Minister is able to provide, in addition to responding to Lord Stevenson's point, further information where the state of play, to carry on the cricketing analogy, is between those aspects, I think that would be most helpful.
I would like to add my support to Amendment 28 and I hope not repeat too much the points that have already been made. The Noble Lord the Minister may have seen the letter from Mike Russell dated 11th March 2019 to which the Noble Lord Purvis has referred. He draws attention to the fact that the Scottish Parliament has not been prepared to give its consent to the trade bill as presently drafted, and that is a matter of some concern. This is not just being obstructed. I think they're taking a measured position based on the Section 2 of the Scotland Act of 2016, to which Lord Purvis has also referred. In his letter, Mike Russell says, as the Scottish Government has pointed out, many of the 24 policy areas currently identified as potentially subject to such regulations are highly relevant in terms of future trade deals, for example, food and feed safety, animal health and welfare, agriculture, environmental policy, food labelling, procurement and fisheries management. It is vital that the Scottish Government and Parliament should be able to protect and advance Scotland's interests and approach in these areas. It is a matter of concern that the bill as currently drafted does not mention either consent or consultation, and I do hope the Noble Lord the Minister will feel able to look at this matter more carefully before we reach third reading. Perhaps I can make two further points. The first is that the wording of Amendment 28, adopting the formula in the Scotland Act, uses the word consent. Now, I recall long arguments as we were debating the European Union Withdrawal Act about whether the word consent should be included in the various provisions there that involve interaction with the devolved authorities. And the way the matter was resolved in dealing with the frameworks in relation to trade was to use the word consult instead of consent. Now, personally, of course, I would argue that we should adopt the formula in the Scotland Act, but it's the fact that the word consult is used in the amendment to the Healthcare International Arrangements Bill, to which the Noble Lord Stevenson referred, that might be worth some reflection on the part of the Noble Lord the Minister, because as Lord Stephen pointed out, the formula used in Amendment 15 in that bill which was an insertion after Clause 4, was that before making regulations under Section 2 that contain provisions that's within the legislative competence of a devolved legislature, the Secretary of State must consult the relevant devolved authority on that provision. That's not as far as the Scottish Government wished, but at least it is a step in the right direction. And given that this is an amendment which was moved by a minister, and in a closely related bill, because it's a part of the general package we're considering, all relating to our departure from the EU, I would hope that the Minister and his bill team would be able to give careful consideration as to whether that formula should be adopted if the Minister is not prepared to accept the formula in 28. The difference between consent and consult is quite significant, but consultation at least would go a substantial way to meeting the concerns of the Scottish Government in these very important areas. I add one further point, because I was in the Grand Chamber the other day looking at a statutory instrument which was being made by a UK minister, and it contained within it a substantial amount of amendments to Scottish legislation made by the Scottish Parliament. And I raised the issue as to why that was being done in a UK SI and not being dealt with by the Scottish Parliament itself. And when you look to see the provision, the description in the back about consultation, it was defective because it did not make it clear that the Scottish Government had been consulted about that. Now, this is an example of a statutory instrument made by a minister where one would have thought consultation would be essential, and indeed during the discussion in the withdrawal bill I was assured that the Sewell Convention would be applied, and the narrative was incomplete. It may have been a simply technical error, but it does raise the issue about how easy it is to overlook the need for consultation, at least, unless the matter is on the face of the statute. So I warmly support the points made by the two noble lords in support of this amendment. And if the matter is to be taken away, I do hope that the government will come back at third reading with something which addresses this very important issue.
My Lords, I thank the noble Lord, Lord Stevenson, for this amendment and for his scrutiny of the devolution provisions in the bill throughout its passage. And I also thank the noble Lord, Lord Purvis and the noble Lord, Lord Hope, noble and learned Lord Hope, for his points, which I will address slightly later on. Ensuring that the trade bill works for the whole of the UK remains a priority for the government, and as such, I am pleased to inform your lordships that the National Assembly for Wales voted in favour of granting consent to the trade bill yesterday. So I ask that this House consider this when weighing the scrutiny of the bill in the context of the devolution settlements. The practical purpose of this amendment is that the UK government should, as a matter of course, seek the agreement of the devolved administrations prior to legislating in areas of devolved competence. This is not, in principle, an area of contention. Rather, the question is whether this should be on the face of the bill. And I would like to reiterate that the UK government is committed to not normally using the powers in the trade bill to legislate in areas of devolved competence without the consent of the relevant devolved administrations, and certainly not without first consulting them. We have respected the role of the devolved administrations through our programme of engagement with the devolved administrations, government amendments in the other place, and my renewed commitment today. And the government will maintain this commitment. More broadly, the UK government has been working productively and collaboratively with the devolved administrations on a number of fronts. UK government officials are working with devolved administration officials to revise the common frameworks analysis and take into account progress on framework areas since March 2018. The government anticipates publishing a further iteration of this analysis shortly. And my Lords, during the debates that we have had on this legislation, there have been many areas of agreement between us and noble lords on the opposite bench. And indeed, the noble Lord, Lord Stevenson, was correct to say during committee that the use of the powers in devolved areas is, and I quote him, more complicated than can be dealt with within the confines of the trade bill. Additionally, this amendment risks setting a precedent whereby competence for policy making is defined outside of the established devolution settlements. This amendment seeks to go further than the Convention already recognised in the most recent Scotland and Wales Acts, and could require the Court to make a decision on whether or not we are in normal circumstances. And I do not believe it is the intention of this House to introduce new legal uncertainty to our statute book. The Supreme Court made clear in the judgment on the Miller case that it doesn't believe it is appropriate for the courts to police the Sewell Convention, as it does not lie within the constitutional remit of the judiciary. By inviting this potential judicial scrutiny, this amendment could obstruct the programme of continuity that this bill seeks to deliver, as the use of the powers could be substantially delayed to the detriment of the UK as a whole. I'd now like to move to the point that the Noble Lord Stevenson raised when he mentioned the healthcare bill. As you know, I was not involved in that healthcare bill, but I hope that I can help, because the amendment to the healthcare bill is to consult only. Amendment 28 would be a consent requirement, and these are very different, and this plays into the point that the Noble and Learned Lord Hope raised. For reasons that we have set out, the consent requirement would create a legal test for the courts and therefore uncertainty, and the powers in the healthcare bill are different too. The benefit of the concurrent powers in the trade bill allows for the relevant administrations to legislate themselves where a matter falls under devolved competence, and allows ministers of the Crown to make regulations for the whole UK when that makes sense. As well as the benefits to the devolved administrations of concurrent powers, we have made repeated commitments to always consulting the relevant devolved administration on the floor of both houses. And just to take up a point that the Noble and Learned Lord Hope raised about creating legal uncertainty. While it has been titled Convention, the amendment uses words that appear designed to turn the Convention into a legal test. The amendment uses the words may not normally, which appear to be designed to make it a legal rule justiciable by the courts. And this could be a substantial block on the use of the Clause 1 and 2 powers. It could lead to delay through litigation, or ultimately a block on the use of the powers if the court judged the situation to be normal. And this would allow a challenger potentially to have the power to withhold consent over the implementation of a part of an agreement, meaning the UK could not bring it into force until it is resolved.
I'm grateful for Mr giving way, and I would clearly always defer to the Noble and Learned Lord Hope on these issues. But I just have a slight anxiety when I heard the Minister bringing at the dispatch box saying for UK ministers to make regulations where they would consider make sense. That is not language that we have become accustomed to in the devolution practices over the last 20 years, because UK ministers could almost all the time say that it makes sense for them to bring forward these regulations, especially in the context of trade agreements that they themselves have negotiated. But that is not the point. The point is that the legislative competences are not the UK ministers. They are in other bodies. And therefore, all we're asking for, I think, is that the practices that have been developed, which is now adopted in the Scotland Act, which has got the language of recognising that the Parliament of the United Kingdom will not normally legislate, that is now well established. That is in statute. So I can't see why the government is saying that this would cause problems in a separate statute, because it is already in statute.
Well, listen carefully to what the Noble Lord has said. The point that he raised was the point that I raised about making sense, and legislative efficiency after consultation with the devolved administrations is what we're looking for. So, in effect, I do believe we're on the same side of the fence. But given that we're getting into some quite detailed discussions here and debates, my job is to give answers. It may be helpful if we go into such detail outside the chamber with a further meeting. But I hope so far, and I haven't finished yet, my lords, that so far I'm giving some reassurance to Noble Lords. Returning to my opening point, the vote yesterday in support of a legislative consent motion by the National Assembly for Wales is a significant endorsement of the trade bill, and I am pleased that the UK government has been able to meet all of the Welsh government's requests to improve the bill. The Assembly's vote recognises the UK government's meaningful efforts in ensuring that the bill works for the UK, and I hope that I provide sufficient reassurance on the Government's commitment and the potential unintended consequences of this particular amendment. And therefore, I do ask for Amendment 28 to be withdrawn.
Before the sits down, perhaps I can return to the word normally, to which you drew attention. I do recognise that the Supreme Court, in its judgment of the Miller case, has made it quite difficult for anybody to take a case before the court based on the use of the word normally. And indeed, the convention itself is, as I've said, is not justiciable. But in a way, that is the value, or shows the sense of the formula which is used in the Healthcare International Arrangements Bill, because it doesn't use the word normally. It just says that the Secretary of State must consult. Now, normally, of course, if you're asking for consent, a higher level of cooperation is a useful qualification. Normally requires consent, but when you're talking about consultation, really consultation is a sine qua non of proper legislation where the devolved administrations are concerned. So the formula in that amendment, I would have thought, would not give rise to the same concern, which is why I do suggest that the Minister might like to consider very carefully whether in this bill it would not be appropriate to adopt the same provision. I appreciate what the Minister said about the consent of the Welsh Assembly, but it's a matter of some concern. The Scottish Government is particularly sensitive in these issues, and it would be a pity to say to the Scottish Government, just because the Welsh have agreed that the Scots should just accept the provisions. They are making their own arguments based on what they know is important to them. And therefore, I do hope that the Minister will pay very close attention to the point made.
This has been a very useful little debate, and I'm grateful to the Noble Lord Younger for raising all the points he has done and giving such a full response. May I just check with him? He did say, and it will be on Hansard, that he would be happy to have further discussions about the issue. And I appeal to him and his good sense that, given the fact that we're already in debate with him and his officials on a number of issues, this could, with advantage, be added on to the list. Not that we have any particular reason to necessarily want to bring it back in any aggressive form in third reading, but I do think the issues raised are just worth further discussions, particularly in the light of the fact that the government has chosen to legislate in the Healthcare International Arrangements Bill, and that, irrespective of whether or not it has direct read across to the Trade Bill, will have set a standard which we've got to be careful we're not either missing or exceeding in a way which will be detrimental to any future discussions on trade. So I would be very willing to withdraw this amendment if we could make it absolutely clear that there is an understanding that there will be further discussions, because it's a point that is not yet fully resolved. But I give an undertaking that there's not sense in any sense to try and make this difficult for the government. I just think it would be worth going a further round to get this right. I'll pause for a second to ask if he could respond.
Very happy to respond to that, and as I said earlier, I'm very happy to be part of further discussions.
That would satisfy us that we have a further meeting, principally with those who've raised points in this debate. I don't think we're far apart on this, but if we can work out what exactly we want said in a way which will advance the chances of getting a better result for all concerned, that would be the right way forward. And on that basis, I beg leave to withdraw my amendment.
Does the Noble Lord we'd like to wish to move Amendment 27? Because his amendment be agreed to. Many of our that have been say content. Colin not content, content have it. Amendment 28, Lord Stevenson, not moved. Not moved. Amendment 29 and 30, move formally. Because these amendments be agreed to. Many of our that have been say content. Contrary not content, content have it. After clause 10, Amendment 31, Baroness Brown of Cambridge.
To move amendments 31 and 32 in my name and those of my noble friend the Earl of Kinnoul and the noble lady the Baroness Mackintosh of Pickering. Amendment 31 relates to the presumption in favour of adoption of trade measures, and it will be familiar to you from the committee stage. The Taxation Cross-Border Trade Act sets the overarching rules under which the UK's new Trade Remedies Authority will operate. The Act does not have a clear or explicit presumption in favour of adoption of trade measures akin to the EU equivalent, the Union Interest Test. When considering whether measures are in the interests of the UK, this consideration involves taking into account 5 different sets of interests. In doing this, unlike the EU approach, the Act does not give priority or special consideration to the interests of the complainant industry. It is this special consideration that gives the EU test a presumption in favour of adoption of measures, and it is this that is absent in the UK Act. Whilst government amendments at report stage of the Taxation and Cross-Border Trade Act improved the wording around the economic interest test, and ministers have privately assured manufacturers that the intention is that there is a presumption in favour of adoption of measures, the words contained in the Act fall short of such a presumption. At this point, I would like to thank the Noble Lady the Minister for helpful meetings with both Lord Kinnoul and myself on this issue, and I hope that the Noble Lady, in her reply, will be able to clarify the presumption that the TRA will apply when they conduct the test. An explicit reference to special consideration of the need to remove injurious dumping would be particularly helpful. Let me now move on to Amendment 32, which relates to the way the detailed rules for the operation of trade remedies will be scrutinised. These rules will have profound impacts on UK manufacturers' ability to level the playing field when overseas competitors don't play by the rules. Many of these rules about the operation of trade remedies will come through secondary legislation as a result of the provisions of the Taxation and Cross-Border Trade Act. We believe that trade policy generally, including specific issues such as these, is of such importance that we should be discussing it frequently in your Lordship's House, a sentiment I believe the Minister herself might also support. Amendment 32 would require these statutory instruments to be affirmative instruments to be discussed and approved by resolution of both Houses. I will be interested to hear from the Noble Lady the Minister about the opportunities that your Lordship's House will have to debate important trade policy issues. I beg to move.
The member proposed to insert the new clause printed on the martial list.
My Lords, my name is added to these 2 amendments, and I will be very brief, and I agree with every word that the Noble Lady Baroness Brown has just said. And I should add my thanks to the ministerial team and the bill team who have been very gracious and given of their time generously to discuss these issues. I have nothing to add to what the Noble Lady Baroness Brown said about Amendment 31, with which I wholly agree. About Amendment 32, I also agree with what she said on that. I would like just to add one more point, and that is arises out of the report of the Constitution Committee into the Trade Bill, and they said, and I quote, while talking about the formation of the Trade Remedies Authority, while we recognise the pressing timescales and uncertainties concerning Brexit, in constitutional terms, creating and empowering an important public body in such a manner is inappropriate. And I very much agree with that assertion, and I therefore regard Amendment 32 in part not only as a mechanism for debate, but also as a partial cure for the problem that the Constitutional Committee has unearthed in its report. And I therefore see it as being an attempt to try and address somewhat that problem. And I wonder whether the Noble Lady the Minister could comment on that, and could comment, if she feels that this amendment should not be agreed to, how we will address the itch that the Constitutional Committee has identified.
3 very quick points. Firstly, I think we need to be clear that Amendment 31 is simply trying to attach the word special consideration rather than take account. It's not that they're not there, all these factors are there and they will be considered. The point is that a special consideration should be given to this. It seems to me, speaking purely for myself, it is not necessary to do that, since I think the nature of the structure in Schedule 4 would suggest that precisely would be the case. So I can't say I support Amendment 31. Amendment 32, temperamentally I want to support it, but I fear the practical issue is that there will be many such regulations, and it really would be not the best use of the time of your Lordship's houses, this house and the other house, the other place, to be engaged in repeatedly approving regulations of this kind. But can I take the opportunity of saying those two things on these amendments, just to say I am interested if the Minister has anything to add on the announcements today about tariffs, which we foreshadowed in the debate last week and have been announced possibly today. I think it is said that all the existing remedies that are presently imposed by the European Union would be continued and even under a no-deal scenario by the United Kingdom. I just want to inquire, and the Minister might choose to reply by letter subsequently, to what extent it is going to be sustainable for us to do that when clearly the remedies will have been assessed in relation to the European Union as a whole rather than to the United Kingdom itself. So, for example, an increase in imports leading to injury to an industry might well be applied by the European Union in relation to an industry in Italy or in Spain. And it wouldn't be appropriate for such a remedy to be applied in the United Kingdom. And I think they would very rapidly be open to challenge if we don't get the Trade Remedies Investigation Department which is up and running in the Department for International Trade, to get on the case so that we can, if we have to, I hope we don't, but if we have to, we are able to apply remedies on the basis of an investigation with UK data rather than EU data.
My Lords, I thank the noble Lady Brown of Cambridge and the noble Earl Lord Kinnoul for tabling their amendments and for clarifying in advance their concerns with me and the ministerial team. Before I respond fully to these amendments, I would like to take the opportunity to draw your Lordship's attention to the steps that the Government has taken to ensure that the UK is ready to deliver a fully operational trade remedies system by exit day. The Government has brought forward legislation under the Taxation Cross-Border Trade Act 2018 to establish the UK trade remedies system in the event that we leave the EU without a withdrawal system. These regulations also temporarily confer trade remedy functions on the Secretary of State until the Trade Remedy Authority, or TRA, is legally established. Staff have already been recruited into the DIT with the intention of transferring to the TRA on royal assent of this bill, including those trained as investigators, the key function of this body, and will carry out their functions as the Trade Remedies Investigations Directorate within the department. The Directorate started working on the 6th of March and will deliver trade remedy functions in-house pending legal establishment of the TRA. But let me repeat, this arrangement will only be temporary. As their Lordships will appreciate, this is a necessary and pragmatic operational contingency to ensure continuity of protection for UK businesses. And this must, of course, remain, we believe, the Government's priority. It is right that we plan for all eventualities, including where, for whatever reason, the TRA is not legally established under this bill by the 29th of March. As the Secretary of State explained in his previous letter to the International Trade Committee on the 14th of February, these regulations ensure that we can deliver a fully operational trade remedies system for any eventuality, but we are clear that the TRA remains the long-term, sustainable way of delivering an independent trade remedies function. Our commitment to establishing the TRA as a non-departmental public body at arm's length from Government has not changed. We believe we must have an independent TRA, and we must have it in the near future. To ensure consistency, the Trade Remedies Investigations Directorate will follow the same policy and procedures as set out in the relevant legislation. Most importantly, the Directorate will carry out objective investigations and will make evidence-based decisions for consideration by the Secretary of State on whether or not measures should be put in place. Indeed, their lordships will see that the relevant legislation laid before the other place last week sets out how the TRA will operate as an independent arm's-length body. But if this preferred approach is not possible by exit day, then the legislation also includes the necessary modifications to confer functions on the Secretary of State. These modifications will automatically expire when the TRA is legally established, with no need for further amendments. The message is clear. The UK will act decisively to address trade issues which cause injuries to our domestic industries in an unfair way. As soon as the TRA is established, subject to the will of Parliament, it will of course take on responsibility for delivery of that function. The Government is committed to tackling unfair trade and injurious practice in all sectors, including, and I know that the noble Baroness Lady Brown is particularly interested in the ceramic sector. It is one of the UK's most iconic industries, exports world-class pottery around the world, and the call for evidence concluded that both existing EU trade remedies should be maintained for the UK's ceramics industry. And we will continue to operate a trade remedies regime which provides a robust safety net for our industries, which enable the UK to be a leading proponent. I hope this reassures the House that we are taking the right steps in the national interest, pressing ahead with the trade bill as planned, but also ensuring there is a necessary operational contingency preparations. They are put in place if required. Now, my Lords, turning to Amendments 31 and 32. My Lords, the policy framework that the TRA will be responsible for operating is already established in the Taxation Cross-Border Trade Act 2018. With regards to Amendment 31, let me be absolutely clear. That Act already sets out a presumption in favour of measures in all dumping and subsidies investigations. As I explained to the House during committee, the Government amended the Act during its passage to emphasise this point and clarify that the TRA must consider, and I quote, the injury caused by the dumping of the goods or the importation of the subsidised goods to a UK industry in the goods and the benefits to that industry in removing that injury. Furthermore, the Government will be publishing guidance on the economic interest test, which will reiterate this presumption and specify that the TRA must make a recommendation to impose measures unless it can show that anti-dumping or anti-subsidy measures would have disproportionate impacts on the wider UK economy. So let me repeat the reassurance that I gave the noble Lady Brown during committee that this presumption will apply when the TRA conducts the test. It has not been possible to mirror exactly the wording of EU regulations in our statute book. There was a very helpful intervention by my noble friend, Lord Lansley. It's about special consideration, has a specific meaning under EU law, does not have the same meaning under UK law. But we are absolutely clear that we share the intent of giving that special consideration to the injury caused to UK industry by imports of dumped or subsidised goods. The language in the Act achieves the same outcome of the explicit presumption in favour of anti-dumping and anti-subsidy measures. Turning to Amendment 32, of course, this too refers to the Taxation Cross-Border Trade Act 2018, which has already been considered and passed in the other place. This House will have seen that the provisions in the secondary legislation contain a great deal of technical detail. That is why it was accepted that the negative resolution procedure is the appropriate scrutiny mechanism. Indeed, the Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee of this House have considered the provisions of the Act, and they did not comment on the use of negative procedures. In terms of the noble Earl Lord Canul's question about the parliamentary scrutiny, we have considered the right balance between primary and secondary legislation. We want the UK to have a robust, responsive, WTO-compliant trade remedy system. And the technical provisions set out in secondary legislation must be compliant with WTO law. That means that we need the flexibility for the UK to adapt to frequent developments in WTO case law. Anti-dumping and anti-subsidy measures are some of the most frequently litigated issues at the WTO. We have laid secondary legislation before the other place on the 5th of March, having the details of the UK framework ready to be operational as an example. The existing procedures will allow for parliamentary scrutiny of this secondary legislation. My noble friend Lord Lansley also asked the question about trade remedies, and will all the trade remedies currently existing in the EU be moved over? I would like to be clear on this. Our commitment is to make sure that the UK will only apply those EU trade remedies which matter to UK industries. This, I hope, will give my noble friend the reassurance about the potential issue with WTO compliance, which he highlighted. My Lords, I trust that my responses have provided reassurance to your Lordships, and that the noble Lady Brown and the noble Earl, Lord Canoul, would feel able to withdraw their amendments.
I thank the noble lady, the Minister, for her detailed response. It's very encouraging to hear of the progress with the implementation of the trade remedies system, and also with the work being done to ensure that, should we need it, provisions will be in place to support industry in this way on exit day, should the TRA not be legally established by that point. It's also good to hear her say that the government intends that we will act decisively on injury to domestic manufacturers such as our ceramics industry, and I thank her very much for the reassurance that the intent of the Act is that there will be, and I'll put it in inverted commas, special consideration for hurt to manufacturers when the economic interest test is applied. I think that's I'm very comfortable with the reassurance, the very strong reassurance she has given there, and I beg leave to withdraw Amendment 31. On Amendment 32, I accept the argument that there will be there will be a large number of SIs containing a great deal of technical detail, and that's the reason for the negative procedures. I still have concerns that there will be some very important issues, however, coming through under these negative procedures, and these trade remedy issues will indeed be some of those. So it is with some reluctance that I beg to withdraw Amendment 32.
Is your Lordship present Amendment 31 being withdrawn? Amendment Barley withdrawn. Amendment 32 not moved. Amendment 32A, Baroness McIntosh of Pickering. Not moved. Amendment 32B, Baroness McIntosh Pickering. Not moved. Out Clause 12, Amendment 33, Lord Billy Moria or Lord Hannay of Chiswick, or Lord O'Neill of Belgrave.
So my noble friends Lord Billy Moria and Lord Hannay, I wish to move Amendment 33. It's yet another amendment on trade in the cultural industries, which has become a very important export sector, with the distinctive feature that some of the exports, in particular educational services, bring people to this country rather than sending goods to other countries. The amendment seeks to improve the statistical basis for estimating the number of overseas students coming to this country. At present, the way these are estimated is not very satisfactory. Statistics are produced by the ONS, who calculate it as coming out at 7.2 billion, and by the DFE, who calculate that it comes out as 19.9 billion. That is really quite a big gap. And the aim of the amendment is to improve the statistics, making it easier to set an export target for this sector. I think there's a clear need for complete and unambiguous information, and although the students do the travelling, it is an export, and indeed a very valuable export, in which this country has an important place. Although we have targets set, it doesn't make very much sense to be setting targets until one has clarity about the metrics, and this is about the metrics and getting the target right. I beg to move.
Amendment proposed to insert the new clause has been put on the master list.
My Lord, I was added as the fourth batsman here, so, I have nothing to add to the very clear presentation of the Noble Lady Baroness O'Neill, apart from one thing, and that is that you will note in the amendment, paragraph 1F, which is that included in the statistical information would also be some estimation of the tourism expenditure of visitors to the UK visiting the students who are studying here. The reason for that is that this is in fact being collected in Australia, and the Australians have discovered that it is quite a big economic driver, and it is very much something which has led them to feel that they have a jewel in the crown of educational exports, and they're trying to grow it. And I think the more we understand the numbers and the statistics of this mighty business that we have in Britain, the more we would be likely to feed it and to help it. And so I bring that to the House's attention.
Very briefly, I would say that, my Lords, we've heard about the soft power of education many times as it reaches out around the world. This is a way of collecting actually the hard data around the economic benefit to this country, and I can't see why the government wouldn't be able to support this going forward.
My Lords, the Government welcomes international students who make a valuable contribution to the UK, both economically and culturally. They bring greater diversity to university and college campuses and an international dimension to the experience of all students. They also stimulate demand for courses and add to the UK's impressive research capacity. In the longer term, they offer the prospect of productive business, political, cultural and research links. Of course, they also bring welcome income to UK universities and our wider economy. We're pleased that the UK remains a highly attractive destination for international students. UK higher education institutions hosted almost 460,000 EU and non-EU students in 2017 to 18, my Lords, the highest on record. There remains no limit on the number of students who can study here, and there are no plans to introduce one. On the back of the Higher Education and Research Act, there is the provision for a faster and simpler route for high-quality new providers to enter the sector and gain degree-awarding powers. And of course this allows the sector to diversify and strengthen its international offer, providing even better opportunities to students from all over the world. The Department for Education currently publishes data on the value of UK education exports annually. These statistics cover education exports and transnational activity relating to higher education, further education, schools, English language training and products and services. And I was grateful for the comments that were made by the Noble Lord Fox and the Noble Earl Lord Canul and also the Noble Baroness Lady O'Neill, because it is important to look at the statistics. And let me start by giving a view of the statistics that we already publish. The latest education exports data publication was January 2019. This set out that total education exports and transnational education activity were estimated to be almost £20 billion in 2016. International students at higher education institutions contributed £11.9 billion in exports through living expenditure and tuition fees alone that year. and this accounts for around 60% of the total value of education exports and activity. The fee income data is compiled from the Higher Education Statistics Agency, which Noble Lords will have heard of, so-called HESA, finance data, which covers finance data records. Living expenditure for EU and non-EU domiciled students is estimated using the Student Income and Expenditure Survey. The statistics are new and are in an experimental data stage in the classification of official statistics. This is because the data and underpinning methodology come from various sources with differing degrees of quality and maturity. For example, there is good data on the fee income generated by the number of international students studying at our universities, but there is not a systematic collection of revenue from transnational education activity. And this must be derived through a variety of estimation techniques. Similarly, not all elements of international education expenditure are available on a regional basis. The data proposed through this amendment is therefore either already used as part of the export data we publish or is unavailable, and in that case we cannot legislate to make it so. But we share the Noble Lord's desire for better data on education exports to support our ambitions in this area. As announced by the Chancellor in a written ministerial statement today, the new international education strategy will be published in due course, and it will set out the government's ambitions for growing the UK's education exports. And this will include making sure that we optimise our position in the market for promoting a competitive and welcoming offer for international students. So the importance of statistics is extremely important. But I hope with that explanation, I would ask for the amendment to be withdrawn.
I thank the Noble Lord the Minister for a very interesting reply, and of course the publication of the new document makes me look forward to in the near future, or whenever it is due to appear, imminently. I think that to get the statistics right is not a simple matter. This interacts in ways that are quite difficult with the metrics that we are using for our own domestic students and for quality control. It is surely important to get it right. And since I hear the note of optimism that there will be an attempt made to get it right, I beg leave to withdraw the amendment.
It is your Lordship's pleasure that this amendment be withdrawn. Amendment is by leave withdrawn. Amendment 34, Lord Stevenson of Belmacara.
My Lords, when I first joined your Lordship's House, I was given tutelage in the ways and proceedings of your Lordship's House, and indeed I had a watcher who held hands with me, as it were, right through my opening period. And one of the first things he said to me was that when you ever get a new bill, look at the commencement clauses, because they're the ones that tell you how serious the government are about our intentions. And hidden in the interstices of the commencement clauses is often a very good clue about how things happen. Some of them come into effect, some of the powers in a bill come into effect immediately a bill receives royal assent. Quite a lot do not, and that for them there is usually a procedure under which various elements come forward under regulatory procedures, which are somewhat difficult to guess sometimes, but which are very important to follow through to the logical conclusion. 9 years ago, that was seared in my brain as an important thing. I've never had the opportunity to do anything about it until today, and I'm delighted, therefore, to bring forward an amendment, my first amendment, on a commencement clause. And what a clause it is, what an amendment it is. As we speak, divisions are happening in another place, which will bear, I think, to some extent on the future of this bill in its entirety. Because the consideration, of course, has been given to the question of whether there is a no deal or not. We have anticipated some of the thinking of that by wondering whether it would be sensible to give regards to the question of whether or not this bill in its entirety had a commencement at all, in relation to whether or not the other place had actually resolved that measures that would be affected by the legislation contained in this bill had been given satisfactory agreement by the House of Commons. And so there are two parts to this. there has to either to have been a withdrawal agreement and framework for the future relationship in relation to the EU to have been approved by resolution of the House of Commons in a motion moved by a Minister in terms of Section 13(1)(b) of the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, or the House of Commons has passed a motion that the House approves of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union without a withdrawal agreement or a framework for the future relationship. So these are quite tight and narrow constraints on the ability of this bill to come out into force. They're important because they tie, in a sense, the whole of the debates and discussions about our future relationship and trade in its widest context to the question of what exactly it is that the government intends for the future of the country in relation to the Withdrawal Act. And the whole process it can only take into effect on the formal passing of motion or motions by the House of Commons. Now, this may not be the night in which such an motion takes place. As I understand that the motion, the amendments selected for discussion today do not fulfil the criterion set out in the European Withdrawal Act as being binding on the government, although they will give us a clear view about where things go. But we've been saying for ages, indeed my credibility is shredded by the number of predictions I've given to my family about what I thought was happening, all of which have turned out to be wrong, and I'm not proposing to go further tonight than just simply say activity is happening which may have a bearing on the future of this amendment. And with that, I recommend to your Lordship's House that we seriously consider this amendment, and if necessary, I would like to test the opinion of the House.
The amendment proposed, insert the new clause as printed in the Marshall list.
My name is on this amendment, and it seems to me to be an extremely sensible one. I support what has just been said. I, of course, had no mentor when I came into this House. I had no one to hold my hand. So, as will be obvious to all, I am lost, particularly on the details of commencement. But it seems to me that one of the virtues of this this amendment is that it would rule out the proceeding in the event of an accidental no deal. Now, it seems to me that an accidental no deal is still a real possibility. I think any form of no deal would be an act of self-harm, which I hope will be rejected very strongly in a very few minutes. I was very sorry to see that some members of the government were proposing to vote for self-harm, which is very odd. The doctrine of cabinet responsibility seems to have fallen by the wayside if they are on an issue where, as important as this, it is impossible to have a government line which all the cabinet would stick to. It seems to me that since Sir Robert Walpole's time, the defining characteristics of British cabinet government is cabinet responsibility is shared by a group of friends who can command a majority in the House of Commons. It seems that both of these conditions are not met. I'm not sure how relevant that point is to the amendment in the name of Lord Stevenson, of Balmacara and me, so I'll merely say I support it.
My Lords, we are coming towards the final stages of this report stage, and it is right that we reflect very briefly on why we have this bill. Primarily, this bill was here in case there was a no-deal Brexit. Many of the provisions are there that the government told us has to be in place before exit day for preparedness that in case there was a no-deal exit. Well, that was the intention in January 2018 when the Commons first debated this bill, and we received it in September. It was still the government's intention then that there would be plenty time to have this bill on the statute book in order to be the framework for the whole slew of continuity agreements that we were all going to be considering? Well, we have 3 so far that we'll be debating later today, representing 0.3% of UK exports. So if we are going to be going down the direction of having this bill on the statute book, which is primarily there in order to facilitate a no-deal Brexit, it is right that that is an intentional decision by the House of Commons, that is indeed the path that we go on. If Lord Stevenson presses this amendment, we will support it, because it can be unconscionable to use a word of the Attorney General, that we could somehow now at this stage find ourselves inadvertently in a no-deal scenario. But we will have to reflect to some extent on what the House of Commons decides. Lord Kerr is absolutely right. Not only has Cabinet collective responsibility now been ditched, but there's not even any kind of collective responsibility within the Treasury. The Chancellor today stated the damage, the shock to the economy, the deeply damaging elements that a no-deal Brexit would bring about. His deputy disagrees with him and will be in the separate division lobby in the other place this evening. So whatever the House of Commons will decide, it is right that we provide a degree of certainty in this legislation that we cannot accidentally go down the path of a no-deal Brexit. If this bill is to be enforced to provide that framework, it will have to be on the basis of a majority and another place specifically asking for it, and that is why this amendment is very justified. As I said, if Lord Stevenson presses it, we will very happily support it.
Can I just say, I regret that it is not the case that if we were to amend the bill in this way, and I profoundly believe we should not leave the European Union without a deal in place, but putting this amendment into this bill does not prevent that happening. That has to be stopped, and it has to be stopped in another place, and it has to be stopped with legislation or through the revocation of Article 50, and this amendment does not bear on that. What this amendment would do, unfortunately, is remove from us the power in that unhappy event of implementing, for example, the agreement that has been reached with Switzerland. It's not ideal, but it's there. It has been entered into in good faith by ourselves and the Swiss on the basis that it is a measure that if the event arises, we have to have it available. It is also, I'm afraid, not true, as the Noble Lord Purvis of Tweed says, that the bill is entirely occasioned for the eventuality of no deal. It enables us, for example, to establish the Trade Remedies Authority, and we've just heard about the valuable work they are doing, and it implements the government procurement on agreement. And that is a very large-scale issue for British services companies and others who want to be able to bid internationally under the WTO for such contracts. And if we were to frustrate, the effect of this amendment would be to stop this bill coming into force. We wouldn't therefore be able to ratify the international government agreement on procurement in the way that we were intending, and it would deprive businesses of that opportunity. It seems to me that the amendment, much as I heartily concur with its intention, it doesn't have the effect that it's looking for. I don't want to go, I've finished.
Just with the points with regards to the ability to have the regulations on the Swiss agreement, the government isn't using the likely regulatory powers under this bill to ratify the Swiss agreement. So I don't think his point is accurate on that point. They're using the Crag process, not this bill.
That's what their intentions are. But as I understand it, in a number of instances, and I think the Swiss are amongst them, we will use effectively what are not just the bilateral agreements with the Swiss, but the opportunity to roll over the EU-Swiss agreements into UK-Swiss agreements, and the power here is available for that purpose.
Lord, I think it's also worth pointing out that in the event of a no deal accidentally, if that can happen, I hope not, Lord Haynes' amendment this afternoon would be negatived as well.
My Lords, I thank the noble Lord, Lord Stevenson of Balmacara, and the noble Lord, Lord Kerr of Kinlochyd. I'm particularly delighted to be able to be at the dispatch box answering the noble Lord, Lord Stevenson's inaugural commencement amendment. My Lords, we have had extensive debates on the trade bill, during which I believe all sides have acknowledged the importance of its provisions. I also do not believe that this House disagrees with the underlying principles of this bill. As my noble Lord, my friend Lord Lansley pointed out, this is not a bill just for no deal situation. It is to cover whatever the outcome of the negotiations with the EU. And I hope and trust that your lordships will acknowledge the need for any responsible government to bring forward these provisions. The trade bill covers 4 important areas for consumers and for businesses. This House has debated them, is well rehearsed in them, and I do not suggest repeating the key ones in detail here today. But the fundamental point, which I hope your lordships will consider carefully, is that if we do not enact this trade bill in a timely fashion, it will have a direct and adverse impact not just on our consumers but our businesses. My Lords, I'm very aware that there are activities at this hour elsewhere that may have a bearing on this debate. But let me say that my noble friend Lord Lansley's comment that if passed, this bill, as written, could have very serious consequences for the UK. If a vote is passed in the other place ruling out a no deal, but no motion is approved in favour of a withdrawal agreement, then the default position at law is that UK will leave the EU at 11 p.m. on the 29th of March. It will, as a number of their lordships have said, would be an accidental no deal. It's not what the government is wanting, which is to have a deal. But if that happens, the effect of this amendment would be to prevent the commencement of the substantive provisions of this bill. I do not believe that that is the intention of the noble lords who are proposing it. Nevertheless, that is what would happen. The UK would leave the EU without a deal, without any protections offered by the bill, and I do not believe that anyone wants to see that. Turning to the noble Lord, Lord Kerr's comment that this amendment rules out an accidental no deal, we do not believe that it rules that out. It merely would have the unintended consequence, I believe, that if there were to be an accidental no deal, the provisions would be prevented from this coming into force. Furthermore, I can just be clear, just in case, if the Commons, if the other place voted tonight in favour of a no deal, for the purposes of this amendment, the requirements in subsection B would have been met. This would mean that the precondition for commencement would be satisfied, so the amendment would be rendered redundant by events. Furthermore, as far as I am aware, no business groups or other representative organisations have indicated support for this amendment. In fact, many support the need to enact them. The CBI, for example, has stated they remain strongly supportive of the initiative to set up the TRA. Similarly, the British Ceramic Confederation has stated that it is clear that we need a Trade Remedies Authority, and it is certainly welcome that the bill establishes one. We have also heard cross-party support for continuity in both Houses of Parliament, and the International Trade Select Committee also confirmed that it struggled to find a witness who would speak against it. My Lords, I acknowledge and I understand that the passions and views are strongly held about whether this country should remain a member of the EU or leave. However, this should not distract from the core role of Parliament and your Lordship's House to ensure the best for the people and businesses of this country. no matter how strongly your lordships feel about these issues, it is ultimately must be a matter for the elected representatives in the other place to make a decision about the steps this country takes at this important moment in our nation's history. This should not distract us from the content of this bill, the importance of these provisions, and the desire of consumers and businesses to see these vital provisions enacted. My Lords, during scrutiny of this bill, the House has shown itself at its best, holding the government to account and working with the government to improve the legislation. But we do not feel that there is a call for this amendment for the reasons I have stated, and therefore, instead of pressing to a vote, I would hope that the noble Lord, Lord Stevenson, would feel able to withdraw.
Grateful to Noble Baroness, the Minister, for responding in the way she's done. And again, pay tribute to her and her team for the considerable work they've done in trying to make sure that we get through this bill and try and iron out the differences between us. On this, I think we will disagree. The information that I've received is that the other place have voted 312 to 308 against a no-deal exit. So in a sense, we have at least that information in our hand as we think further about how this amendment might play. In response to the noble Lord Landsey, who I have a great respect for and whose knowledge and experience in these matters has been very grateful, very useful to the committee, and indeed has informed our debates throughout the process of this bill. On the GPA, we are, of course, already joined, have already joined, so that has gone through. The regulations that are the power making that's in the bill is actually to make regulations about future changes in the GPA, not about the GPA itself. So in a sense, I disagree with him that we need this at this time. It may be necessary in future, but there may be other opportunities. And on the TRA, as has already been said, most of the establishing framework for the TRA is in another bill already in place. And indeed, as the noble Baroness, the Minister, said, the government has already introduced the regulations which give effect to the powers that are necessary for that to operate effectively, and they are already through the House. So in a sense, the actual power that's in this bill is not necessary. In fact, it is true of this bill. It is not. Many of those powers are not necessary. They were appropriate earlier. They're not so appropriate now. I don't think we are really talking about the substance of this. This is, in some senses, a bit of a wake-up call to the government as well as a broader message to the wider community. And on that basis, I'd like to test the opinion of the House.
The question is that the amendment in the name of Lord Stevenson be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say contend. Yes. The contrary, not contend.
Not contend.
Clear the bar. The question is that the amendment in the name of Lord Stevenson be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. The contrary, not content. Not content. The contents will go to the right by the throne. The not contents to the left by the bar. The question is that this amendment be agreed to. My Lords, my Lords, there have voted contents 193, not contents 154, so the contents have it. Amendment 35, Lord Stevenson move formally. The question is that this motion be agreed, that this amendment be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. Contrary, not content. The contents have it. Amendments 36 to 58. Move formally, Baroness Fairhead. Move formally. Amendments 36 to 58.
Move formally on block.
En bloc. The question is that amendments 36 to 58 be approved en bloc. As many as that opinion will say content. Contrary, not content. The contents have it. Amendment 59, Lord Lansley.
My Lords, a pleasure to be back, Marshall, on this report stage. The purpose of Amendment 59 is to insert into the schedule which sets up the process for appointing the Trade Remedies Authority. It includes that the chair be appointed by the Secretary of State following a report by the International Trade Committee of the House of Commons, effectively to include the chair of the Trade Remedies Authority in the list of appointments that are subject to pre-appointment scrutiny. I don't do this lightly. It seems to me there are about 1,000 senior public appointments, only 50 of which are subject to pre-appointment hearings by select committees. The Cabinet Office guidance in relation to this was reissued, amended and reissued in January of this year. It has 3 criteria in paragraph 8. that they should be posts which play a key role in the regulation of actions by government. I think that clearly must be satisfied in that it determines one of the essential roles of the Department for International Trade in investigating and recommending trade remedies. Secondly, it must be a post which plays a key role in protecting and safeguarding the public's rights and interests in relation to the actions and decisions of government. Well, it may not be the public, but it's definitely business community, so I think ticking that box for the business community would regard this as one of the most important bodies impacting on their interests in relation to the actions of government. And then thirdly, posts that have a major impact on public life or the lives of the public, where it is vital for the reputation and credibility of that organisation that the post holder acts and is seen to act independently of ministers and the government. Well, noble lords will recall that at a much earlier stage we debated a little whether this should be independent, and the government, having looked around the world, decided that the Trade Remedies Authority should be independent and be seen to be independent. So, to me, we have 3 ticks in the box. This is clearly an important appointment. For the Department for International Trade, I think it must be regarded as perhaps the most important appointment. They don't have any other appointments that I know of that they are presently asked to scrutinise prior to the appointment. It seems to me it is a perfectly reasonable way of proceeding. Nor does it actually, as we have discovered, constrain ministers too far. Ministers have to consult, they have to liaise with the Select Committee, they have to respond to the Select Committee and take account of what they've said, but they don't have to do what the Select Committee says, and in quite a number of instances have not done what the Select Committee says. So ministers can still make the appointments that they consider to be the right ones. So I don't feel that I'm holding the government back from doing what they need to do. I'm just encouraging them to include this appointment in that list. So I beg to move.
Amendment proposed, page 19, line 27. At the end, insert the words, following a report from the International Trade Committee of the House of Commons.
I'd like to support Noble Lord Lansley and I congratulate him on the succinctness with which he's made his point. I've been confused for some time as to why the department might resist this, and he's made the points exactly as I would have done them. This is a key role. It has a public-facing responsibility, and it will hold the government to account on issues of great importance. And indeed, it will be, as he said, it's the only body that the DIT will have as a marker, and I think it behoves it to raise it to the appropriate level so that it's seen to be of the importance that they claim it to be. For those reasons, I think it's absolutely right that we have an established routine that the person selected by the Minister to be the chair of this body, and we're not expecting it to be the chief executive or more junior staff. I think it's just appropriate for the chair. Should be seen by the International Trade Committee, and of course, as he says, it's a courtesy in some senses because the minister can still appoint should they wish to do so. I support his amendment.
My Lords, I rise to speak to Amendment 60 in my name and those of my noble friend the Earl of Kinnoul and the noble lady the Baroness Mackintosh of Pickering. I would also like to add my support to Amendment 59. The UK needs a strong and independent Trade Remedies Authority with a balanced membership to investigate alleged dumping and subsidy cases and to recommend remedies. Schedule 4 of the Trade Bill defines the membership of the TRA and its governance, and as I have said before, and as the noble Lord Lansley has emphasised in introducing Amendment 59, whilst both Clause 10 and Schedule 4 make the independence of the TRA a clear objective, this does not sit entirely comfortably with the Chair and indeed the non-executives being appointed entirely at the discretion of the Secretary of State. The government's model of the Office for Students in the Higher Education and Research Act 2017 seems to offer a good model for delivering both independence and balance, and this is the model that has been used in drafting this updated amendment. It would require the Secretary of State to have regard to the desirability of members between them having experience in a number of relevant areas, including UK manufacturing, trade unions, consumers, regional economic growth, regulatory systems and international trade disputes. The government has suggested that the TRA should be managed by trade remedies experts rather than by stakeholders with vested interests in order to be independent. However, the Chief Executive Designate has already told the Commons Select Committee that she is not a trade remedies expert. A properly balanced group of non-executive stakeholders supported by expert executives could be effective, independent and balanced. I look forward to hearing from the Noble Lady, the Minister, how the Government will ensure the combination of independence with balanced and relevant expertise that this important body requires.
My Lords, my name is added to Amendment 60 as well, and I too have the same problems in life with the TRA as currently constituted, in that it seems to me to lack independence, or arguably so, and to lack potentially balance, and it is looking for independence and balance that the amendment has evolved to. I should say that Amendment 59 very much deals with the independence point, and so on that basis I would strongly support it. The independence point is, I said at committee, is important because I think the TRA needs to be seen not to be a mere cipher for the British state. It needs to be seen to be something which has its own life. But it has a problem when one looks at Schedule 4 and sees that the chair is appointed by the Secretary of State. All the non-executive directors are appointed by the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State gets the chance to approve the CEO. The non-executive directors will always be in the majority. And the Secretary of State has the power of removal of any of the non-executive directors. And on top of that, and entitled Guidance, paragraph 34 of Schedule 4 says that the TRA must have regard to the Secretary of State's guidance, which seems to me like instructions, and not at all, it seems to be wrongly titled. And I do worry that therefore the independence bit of my beef is not coped with sufficiently at all. And I look forward to hearing from the Noble Baroness, the Minister, something to assuage my concerns. The balance piece is incredibly important. This cannot be an effective body if there isn't a balance on it, balance of experience and balance of background all round. And the point is obvious, and nowhere do I see in Schedule 4 anything that would give rise to a feeling that there would be balance. But I look forward to hearing I've been corrected on that point.
My Lords, I rise simply to say I don't agree particularly with Amendment 60. I think it's really necessary to have expertise in the TRA. And as actually I said on an earlier occasion, I wasn't convinced that having a completely separate authority was sensible. The European Union seemed to do a very good job on trade negotiations, and that, as I recall it from my experience, both as a civil servant, as a minister, and as a member of business, was in-house. So I would ask the Minister to pause before simply agreeing to these amendments without thinking about them a little bit further.
My Lords, I would like to thank your Lordships for the continued engagement with the work to establish this Trade Remedies Authority. And I trust that I am able to provide reassurance that we are taking proper steps to set this important body up in the right way. If I turn first to Amendment 59, tabled by the Noble my noble friend Lord Lansley and the Noble Lord Stephen of Balmacara. We have listened carefully to the points made by them and other during the committee stage debates about how best to ensure the senior leadership as independent as possible, and this includes the appropriate role for the International Trade Committee. That is why I am pleased to announce that the Secretary of State is content for the International Trade Committee to conduct a pre-commencement hearing of the TRA Chair. This hearing will take place after the Secretary of State has appointed the TRA Chair, but before the Chair has taken up their position. I would like further to reassure this House that this offer of a pre-commencement hearing by the International Trade Committee will apply to all future TRAs, not just the first one. And this, we hope, will ensure that the ITC has the appropriate role in scrutinising any individual appointed to that position. Turning now to Amendment 60, for which I thank the Noble Lady, Lady Brown of Cambridge, and the Noble Lord, the Earl of Kinnoull. I think there are three key issues at hand that I would like to address here. The first point is independence, and I think, having had discussions with both the Noble Lady, Lady Brown, and the Noble Lord, Earl Lord Kinnoull, independence really matters. We are committed to creating an independent TRA that all of our stakeholders can trust and that will be seen by our third-party countries also as an independent body. We have taken clear steps to achieve this, establishing it as a non-departmental public body in the first place, which is different from other organisations around the world, the appropriate degree of separation from ministers. We are ensuring it has an independent board. That is why the Secretary of State will be required to follow the tried and tested Cabinet Office Governance Code on public appointments when appointing all the non-executive TRA board members. And that code, as this House will be aware, enshrines the independence of those members by explicitly stating that, and I quote, all public appointments should be governed by the principle of appointment on merit. TRA board members must be appointed based on their ability, not the stakeholder group or interest that they represent. The Commissioner for Public Appointments will be regulating all non-executive appointments to the TRA, providing independent assurance that the Secretary of State follows the Code's strict rules on making such appointments based on merit and the public interest. While non-executives of the TRA may well have had experience representing certain stakeholders, that alone cannot, we believe, be the reason why they are appointed. We believe that to do otherwise would jeopardise the true independence of the board, particularly as this is an investigative body. The Noble Lady, Lady Brown, referred to the Higher Education and Research Act 2017. We do not feel it's appropriate to draw parallels between the TRA and the Office for Students. The primary function of the Office for Students is to protect the interests of students, whereas the TRA has been set up to protect UK industry from unfair trading practices, which it will do so by undertaking independent and impartial technical investigations into whether unfair trading practices have occurred. Whilst this will ensure that manufacturers are protected against unfair trading practices, the TRA has not been set up specifically to protect the interests of those manufacturers or other groups. The second point relates to the skills and experience. Let me assure your lordships that we are committed to making sure the members are best placed to oversee this important function. That is why the TRA, when appointing the TRA non-executive members, the Secretary of State will have regard to ensuring that the board has the right balance of skills and range of experience. I will do more than pause, as requested by my noble friend, Lady Neville Rolfe. She comes from wide experience on sitting on boards in both public and the private world. And I think it's having that right balance, that right mix of skills and experiences that we find is the most important. Moreover, this process does not happen behind closed doors. To ensure transparency, the requisite skills and experience for each non-executive appointment will be set out in individual TRA job descriptions, which will be published in accordance with standard practice. The Noble Lord, the Earl of Kinnoull, raised a question about the TRA having regard to guidance, and we have included clear statutory restrictions on the Secretary of State's ability to issue guidance to the TRA. That includes setting out specific circumstances in which the Secretary of State can publish guidance. For example, they cannot publish guidance in relation to a specific case. That is also why the Secretary of State must consult the TRA before publishing guidance and explicitly have regard to its independence, its impartiality, and its expertise. These skills and experience requirements include, among others, strong and effective leadership, astute business awareness, and understanding of the complex domestic and international trading environment which the TRA will be operating in. However, we believe specifying a detailed list of desired experience in statute risks restricting the Secretary of State's ability to appoint individuals, and for the Chair and the Board to appoint executives with other relevant experience not detailed here. It suggests that only those criteria listed in legislation are desirable and may inadvertently displace others, and that could create a problem if, in the future, there was the need for a TRA non-executive to fill a skills or experience gap not covered on the list. The final point relates to stakeholders. Let me reassure this House that we understand the needs to ensure that stakeholders' interests are accounted for properly. We have also taken clear steps to ensure this. That is why the TRA Chair's job description and terms and conditions make clear that he or she will be expected to communicate with stakeholders and incorporate their perspectives into TRA board discussions where appropriate. We specifically recognise the importance of the devolved administrations in building the UK's independent trade policy. That is why we have made several key commitments to ensure that they too have an appropriate relationship with the TRA and the DIT. These include sharing the TRA's annual report with each devolved administration, seeking their suggestions for the optimal way to recruit TRA non-executives, and suggesting to the TRA Chair that the Board undergoes specific devolution-focused training. And of course, the Welsh Government has passed a supplementary legislative consent motion in the Welsh Assembly, indicating their support for the TRA provisions in this bill. My Lords, report stage, if I can just make some final concluding remarks, because we are reaching the end of the report stage. This stage has provided us with a really valuable opportunity to test and improve the detail of this important bill. I thank their lordships for that, and I look forward to the third reading next week. Having said that, I respectfully would ask the noble lord to withdraw his amendment.
My Lords, I'm most grateful to my noble friend the Minister for her response to this short debate. And I think it's very fitting that we have further evidence in her response of the constructive and positive way in which ministers have listened to the debate and sought to meet the concerns that have been raised. That has been evident throughout our discussions. I should apologise. I should have declared interest. I am the UK co-chair of the UK-Japan 21st Century Group, and in that context, Sir David Wright, who is the chair designate of the Trade Remedies Authority, was a member of that board. He was a former ambassador to Japan, so I do know him. But I think it will be evident from those who do know him that that the purpose of this discussion is not in any way to question his suitability for this post, far from it, but the process by which his successors in years to come are to be appointed. And in that context, I was very grateful for the specific additional nature of the assurance that my noble friend was able to give. The difference between a pre-appointment hearing in circumstances where the Secretary of State is minded to appoint somebody but then is seen by the Select Committee, or a pre-commencement hearing where the Secretary of State has appointed somebody but that post has not been taken up, is in fact a distinction without a difference. In the circumstances where the Secretary of State could proceed in any case. The point is, I think there is a benefit in such appointments being taken up by those who have been seen by Parliament as well as by the Executive, and not least importantly, I think positively, have done so in the context not of trying to second-guess the Secretary of State's choice of the right person, but to understand right at the outset, before somebody takes up their post, how it is they propose to approach it, their suitability for the tasks, and what their objectives are looking for, what kind of outcomes they're hoping to achieve. And in that respect, what my noble friend was able to say very adequately and fully meets the purposes that I was raising in my amendment. And so I do beg leave to withdraw the amendment.
your Lordship's pleasure that this amendment be withdrawn. Amendment is by leave withdrawn. Amendment 60, Baroness Brown, not moved. Amendment not moved.